Picture this. You're the most powerful man in England. You've got 6 wives. Well, not all at once, but we'll get there. You're swimming in gold. And you can literally change the entire religion of your country just because the Pope won't let you dump your wife. Sounds pretty sweet, right? You're basically living every medieval power fantasy, strutting around in velvet robes, eating swan for breakfast, and beheading anyone who looks at you funny. But here's the kicker. Underneath all that royal swagger, you've got a leg that's rotting from the inside out, leaking pus like a broken faucet, and smelling like death took a vacation in your thigh. Welcome to the glamorous life of Henry VIII, where absolute power meets absolute physical decay. And spoiler alert, the decay wins. This is the story of how a jousting accident turned England's most notorious king into a walking biohazard, and how one festering wound basically shaped the course of English history. Because nothing says, "I'm in charge," quite like needing 4 guys to carry you up the stairs while your leg drips mystery fluids onto the palace floor. The good news is that Henry VIII started out as basically the Renaissance equivalent of a Marvel superhero, tall, athletic, handsome, and talented enough to make everyone else look like peasants at a talent show. The bad news is that all of that went spectacularly downhill faster than you can say off with her head, and by the end of his life, he was basically a 400-pound rage monster with a leg ulcer that could clear a room faster than a fire alarm. We're talking about a transformation so dramatic that if you showed young Henry a picture of old Henry, he'd probably order his future self executed for impersonating him so badly. The really bad news? That leg ulcer wasn't just a gross medical problem. It was a ticking time bomb that influenced every terrible decision he made for the last decade of his reign. When your leg is literally rotting off your body, suddenly beheading your wife for not giving you a son seems like a totally reasonable Tuesday afternoon activity. Let's start at the beginning, back when Henry was actually cool. Born in 1491, young Henry was the spare heir. His older brother Arthur was supposed to be king, which meant Henry got to do all the fun stuff without the boring responsibility. He learned to joust, hunt, compose music, write poetry, speak multiple languages, and generally be the kind of Renaissance man that would make Leonardo da Vinci feel a little insecure. The dude could literally write a love song in the morning, debate theology in the afternoon, and then go kill a deer with his bare hands before dinner. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall in an era when the average height was about 5'7", which basically made him the medieval equivalent of an NBA player walking into a middle school. His athletic abilities were legendary. He could allegedly tire out 8 horses in a single hunt, which is either incredibly impressive or a sign that someone really needed to teach him about pacing. This was the golden boy of England, the prince who had all. Then Arthur died in 1502, probably from tuberculosis or the sweating sickness. And suddenly Henry went from backup singer to lead vocalist. At 17 years old, he became the heir apparent, and in 1509, at the ripe age of 18, he became King Henry VIII. His first act as king? Marry his dead brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, because apparently till death do us part had a loophole for unless my brother wants to recycle you. The Pope gave special permission for this marriage, which would become hilariously ironic later when Henry needed the Pope's permission to divorce her, and suddenly canon law was very important again. Young Henry's reign started with all the promise of a Netflix series that gets renewed for multiple seasons. Everyone was excited, the reviews were glowing, and nobody could predict the absolute dumpster fire that was coming. He threw parties, commissioned artwork, expanded the Navy, and generally acted like a king who had read the job description and thought, yeah, I can do all this and make it look good. Little did anyone know that a jousting accident 27 years later would turn this Renaissance prince into a paranoid tyrant. The fateful jousting accident happened in 1536, and it's the kind of historical turning point that makes you wonder how different the world would be if Henry had just stayed home that day and played checkers instead. Jousting, for those who don't know, was basically the medieval version of NASCAR meets MMA. 2 guys in full armor charging at each other on horses with giant pointy sticks, and whoever didn't die was declared the winner. Henry was 44 years old, which in jousting years is basically geriatric, but he was still convinced he was the athletic god of his youth. During a tournament at Greenwich Palace, his horse fell on him, and Henry was knocked unconscious for 2 hours. 2 hours. That's not a little bump on the head. That's a traumatic brain injury that would have modern doctors checking for brain bleeding and prescribing months of rest. But this was the 1500s, so the medical treatment was probably along the lines of let's bleed him with leeches and pray. The accident left him with a serious leg wound that never properly healed, creating an ulcer that would plague him for the rest of his life. Now, here's where things get medically disgusting and historically fascinating. The leg ulcer that developed after the accident wasn't just a little scratch. It was a deep, chronic wound that constantly oozed pus and blood, had to be drained regularly, and occasionally closed up only to become infected and burst open again like the world's most horrifying surprise party. Modern doctors who've studied the historical accounts believe Henry probably suffered from osteomyelitis, which is a bone infection that's about as fun as it sounds, combined with possible varicose veins that made healing basically impossible. Imagine having an open wound on your thigh that never heals, constantly hurts, occasionally smells like a biological weapon, and requires daily treatments that involve sticking things into the wound to keep it draining. The stench was reportedly so bad that courtiers could smell him coming before they saw him, which really puts a damper on the whole surprise royal visit thing. This wasn't just uncomfortable. This was chronic, agonizing pain that lasted for 11 years until his death, every single day, with no painkillers stronger than alcohol and maybe some herbal remedies that did absolutely nothing. The leg wasn't just gross, it was actively trying to kill him. Every time the ulcer closed up, which happened occasionally because bodies are stupid and don't understand that sometimes drainage is necessary, the infection would build up inside and cause what historians believe were episodes of blood poisoning or septicemia. These episodes would cause massive fever, delirium, mood swings, and probably feelings of impending doom, because that's what happens when your body is literally being poisoned from the inside. One particularly bad episode in 1538 lasted for 12 days and had his doctors convinced he was going to die, which must have made for some very awkward conversations around the palace as people try to figure out whether they should start sucking up to the next heir or keep pretending the current king was immortal. The fact that Henry survived these repeated infections is actually remarkable, because in the 16th century, blood poisoning was basically a death sentence. His survival was likely due to sheer stubbornness, a robust constitution he'd built up during his athletic youth, and probably some genetic lottery luck that gave him an immune system strong enough to fight off infections that would have killed most people. Let's talk about the treatments, because medieval medicine was basically educated guesswork mixed with superstition and a healthy dose of, let's try this and see if he dies. The ulcer had to be kept open and draining, so doctors would stick gold-plated tubes into the wound to keep it from closing. Gold-plated, because apparently regular tubes weren't fancy enough for a king's festering leg wound. They'd pack the wound with various poultices made from herbs, egg whites, and God knows what else, probably including some ground-up unicorn horn or powdered frog testicles, because that was the level of medical sophistication we're working with here. The wound had to be cleaned and redressed multiple times a day, which meant Henry had servants whose entire job was basically royal leg wound maintenance specialists. Can you imagine that on a resume? The pain from these treatments was excruciating, and there was no anesthesia except alcohol, which Henry consumed in impressive quantities, partly for pain relief and partly because when your leg is literally rotting, day drinking seems like a perfectly reasonable life choice. The whole process was so painful and degrading that it would have broken most people. But Henry dealt with it the way he dealt with everything else in his later life, by becoming increasingly paranoid, short-tempered, and convinced that everyone was out to get him. The physical limitations from the leg injury completely changed Henry's lifestyle, and not in a "I've learned to appreciate the simple things" way. Before the accident, Henry was constantly active, hunting, jousting, playing tennis, dancing, and generally bouncing around the kingdom like a hyperactive Labrador retriever with a crown. After the accident, he couldn't do any of that. He could barely walk without assistance. And moving around required either being carried in a chair by servants or using a walking stick, which is pretty humiliating when you're supposed to be the supreme badass of England. So what did Henry do with all that time he used to spend exercising? He ate, and ate, and ate some more. His daily caloric intake has been estimated at around 5,000 calories, which is roughly double what an active adult male needs and way more than a sedentary man with a rotting leg should consume. His meals were legendary. Whole roasted swans, dozens of oysters, venison pies the size of wagon wheels, and enough wine to float a small boat. The combination of immobility and overeating turned him from a fit athlete into a massively obese man whose waist measured 54 inches by the time he died. That's a 54-inch waist in an era when they didn't have elastic waistbands, which means some poor tailor had to keep making increasingly enormous doublets while pretending not to notice that the king was basically spherical. The weight gain wasn't just about vanity or fitting into his fancy clothes. It created a vicious cycle that made everything worse, like a historical version of a medical horror show, where each season gets progressively more terrifying. The extra weight put more pressure on his injured leg, which made the ulcer worse, which made movement more painful, which made him more sedentary, which made him gain more weight, and around we go on the world's most depressing merry-go-round. By the 1540s, Henry needed mechanical devices to move him around the palace. Basically a 16th century wheelchair system involving pulleys, ramps, and multiple strong servants who probably needed hazard pay. Getting the king upstairs required what historians describe as a tram, which was essentially a crane system that hoisted him up like a very expensive, very angry piece of cargo. Imagine being so large that your staff has to install medieval elevator technology just to get you to your bedroom. The indignity of it all would have been crushing for a man who remembered being the most athletic monarch in Europe. But Henry dealt with these feelings in a healthy way, by executing people who annoyed him and eating even more to feel better about himself. The psychological effects of chronic pain are well documented in modern medicine, and they go way beyond just being grumpy. Constant, unrelenting pain literally changes your brain chemistry, increasing stress hormones, decreasing serotonin, and generally turning your personality into something your younger self wouldn't recognize at a family reunion. Henry, who had once been described as charming, generous, and witty, became paranoid, suspicious, cruel, and prone to explosive rages over minor perceived slights. His mood swings were legendary. He could be laughing and joking one moment, then ordering someone's execution the next, like a murderous version of Jekyll and Hyde, except both personalities were kind of terrible. Modern psychologists who've studied his behavior believe he was probably suffering from chronic pain syndrome, depression, and possibly even some cognitive decline from that massive head injury in 1536 that left him unconscious for 2 hours. But here's the thing. When you're the King of England and you're in pain, you can't just call in sick or take a mental health day. You still have to run a country, make life or death decisions, and deal with political crises. Except now you're doing it while your leg is screaming in agony and your brain is marinating in stress hormones and infection-induced fever. The timing of Henry's decline is suspiciously aligned with some of his worst decisions, which makes you wonder how much of English history was basically determined by an infected leg. And Bullen was executed in May 1536, just a few months after Henry's major jousting accident, and around the time his leg problems were becoming chronic. Coincidence? Maybe, but it's worth noting that Henry had been married to, and for 3 years before suddenly deciding she was guilty of adultery, incest, and witchcraft, charges so ridiculous that even his own era's kangaroo court had trouble making them stick. The dissolution of the monasteries, which was basically Henry seizing all the Catholic Church's property in England and selling it off like a medieval liquidation sale, accelerated dramatically after 1536. His fifth wife, Catherine Howard, was executed in 1542, right around the time when his leg ulcers were at their worst and he was having repeated episodes of infection. It's almost like chronic pain and possible brain damage make you a terrible judge of character and prone to paranoid delusions about everyone betraying you. Who could have predicted that the man whose leg was literally poisoning him from the inside might not be making sound decisions about matters of state and matrimony? The court physicians were in an impossible position because treating the king meant walking a tightrope between providing actual medical care and not accidentally implying that his majesty was anything less than perfect. They couldn't tell Henry to lose weight without suggesting he was fat, which was basically asking to have your head separated from your body. They couldn't tell him to stop eating 5,000 calories a day, because that would be criticizing the royal appetite, and criticizing anything about the king was treason. They couldn't give him realistic expectations about his leg healing, because hope was part of the treatment plan, even when that hope was completely delusional. So instead, they tried increasingly desperate treatments, applying poultices made from crushed pearls because expensive medicine is obviously better medicine. Using unicorn horn powder, definitely just narwhal tusk, but don't tell Henry. Bleeding him regularly to balance his humors, which definitely helped with the whole blood loss from the open wound situation. And prescribing various herbal concoctions that range from probably harmless to definitely making things worse. The royal doctors were essentially practicing medicine while their patient held them at gunpoint. Metaphorically speaking, although with Henry, the threat of execution was very literal and very real. One of the most fascinating aspects of Henry's leg situation is how it affected international relations, because apparently you can't have effective diplomacy when your leg smells like a dumpster fire and you're too fat to fit through normal doorways. Foreign ambassadors would report back to their home countries about Henry's declining health, often in coded language, because directly stating the English king is a grotesque, limping mess who reeks of infection seemed diplomatically unwise. The French ambassador in 1541 described Henry as so swollen in the legs that he had to rest them on cushions, and noted that the king's face had become very bloated, which was Renaissance diplomatic speak for "this dude looks rough." These reports influenced how other European powers viewed England's stability. After all, if your king is clearly dying from a leg wound that won't heal, maybe now's a good time to invade, or at least renegotiate some treaties while you have leverage. Henry tried to maintain his image as a powerful, vigorous ruler, but it's hard to project strength when you need a small army of servants just to get you onto your horse for a royal procession. Foreign policy meetings must have been interesting, with Henry trying to negotiate from a position of strength while literally oozing through his bandages and probably fighting the urge to pass out from pain. The smell deserves its own paragraph because historical sources really emphasize just how bad it was. And these were people who lived in an era where bathing was occasional and everyone smelled like a Renaissance fair that had been left in the sun too long. The infection in Henry's leg produced what medical professionals call purulent drainage, which is a fancy way of saying thick, smelly pus that indicates a serious bacterial infection. This drainage was constant, soaking through bandages and requiring multiple changes per day, and the odor was described by contemporaries as foul and noxious, which are words people usually reserve for decomposing corpses or biological warfare. Modern doctors who specialize in wound care say that infected leg ulcers, especially those involving bone infection, produce one of the most distinctive and unpleasant smells in medicine. A sweet, rotten odor that's immediately recognizable and extremely difficult to mask. Henry tried to cover it up with perfumes, herbs, and pomanders, basically fancy medieval air fresheners. But you can't really cologne your way out of a bone infection. Court etiquette required everyone to pretend they didn't notice, which must have been challenging when the king entered a room and everyone's eyes started watering from the stench. This was the man who was supposed to be divinely appointed by God to rule England, and he smelled like death's armpit. The psychological toll of physical decline hit Henry particularly hard because his entire identity was wrapped up in being the athletic, virile, powerful king, and now he was none of those things except powerful, and even that was slipping. He had portraits commissioned that showed him as slimmer and more imposing than he actually was, which is basically the 16th century equivalent of heavy Instagram filtering. The famous Holbein portrait from 1540 shows Henry with his legs apart in a power stance, looking broad and intimidating, but conveniently doesn't show that those legs were swollen, ulcerated, and barely functional. He insisted on being addressed with increasingly grandiose titles and demanded more elaborate shows of deference from his courtiers, because when your body is betraying you, at least you can make people bow lower. His obsession with producing a male heir became even more intense after his injury, probably because he knew his time was limited and he needed to secure the succession before his leg finally succeeded in killing him. The desperate need for a son led to his marriage to Jane Seymour, who finally gave him Edward VI but died shortly after childbirth. Then to Anne of Cleves, whom he rejected for not being attractive enough, which is rich coming from a man whose leg was literally rotting. Then to the teenage Catherine Howard, whom he executed for adultery. And finally to Catherine Parr, who had the good sense to outlive him. The impact on his governance was profound, because running a country while in constant agony tends to affect your decision-making skills in ways that range from questionable to absolutely catastrophic. Henry became increasingly isolated, surrounding himself with yes-men who told him what he wanted to hear rather than advisors who might actually help him make good decisions. His Privy Council meetings became less about policy discussion and more about figuring out which way the king's mood was swinging that day and adjusting their advice accordingly. Major decisions about war, religion, and succession were made by a man who was probably feverish, definitely in pain, possibly slightly drunk for pain management purposes, and generally not in the best mental state to determine the fate of millions of people. The military campaigns he launched in the 1540s against France and Scotland were expensive failures that drained the treasury and accomplished basically nothing except making Henry feel like he was still the warrior king of his youth. These wars were funded by debasing the coinage and selling off monastery lands, which caused inflation and economic problems that lasted long after Henry was dead. All because a man with a rotting leg needed to prove he was still powerful and virile, even though his body was very clearly sending him memos that maybe it was time to retire and take up a nice quiet hobby like stamp collecting. The religious turmoil of Henry's later years was also influenced by his deteriorating condition, though historians debate exactly how much his physical state affected his theological positions. The thing is, Henry didn't break from Rome because he suddenly became a Protestant who believed in justification by faith alone and wanted to reform church doctrine. He broke from Rome because the Pope wouldn't let him divorce Catherine of Aragon, and everything that followed was basically Henry making up theology as he went along to justify whatever he wanted to do at any given moment. But his enforcement of religious policy became increasingly erratic and violent as his health declined. The 6 Articles of 1539, which were super conservative and basically said, "We're not Catholic, but we're also not Protestant. We're whatever Henry says we are," were enforced with executions for anyone who disagreed. Then policy would shift, and suddenly different people were being executed for having the wrong opinions. Then it would shift again. Trying to figure out the correct religious position in Henry's England was like playing theological Russian roulette, while the king's infected leg determined which chamber had the bullet. People were burned as heretics for being too Protestant, then beheaded as traitors for being too Catholic, and nobody could predict which way Henry would swing because his mood depended partly on political calculations and partly on whether his leg was having a particularly bad day. The daily routine of managing Henry's leg wound became a bizarre ritual that combined medieval medicine, royal protocol, and what can only be described as desperation mixed with denial. Every morning, the grooms of the stool and the king's personal physicians would gather for what was essentially the world's most unpleasant royal ceremony, changing the king's leg dressings. This wasn't a quick 5-minute bandage swap. It was an elaborate production involving multiple servants, special instruments, buckets of water, yards of linen bandages, and various medicinal compounds that probably did more harm than good. The wound had to be cleaned, which meant removing the old dressings that were soaked with pus and blood, then flushing the ulcer with various solutions that ranged from wine, which actually had some antiseptic properties, so accidentally good call there, to rose water, which smelled nice but did absolutely nothing medically. Then came the application of poultices and ointments, followed by the insertion of those gold-plated drainage tubes, and finally the wrapping with fresh bandages that would be completely disgusting again by evening. The whole process took at least an hour and was excruciatingly painful, which is why Henry usually demanded wine or ale beforehand to take the edge off, essentially pre-gaming his own medical treatment. The servants who had to perform these duties were in a uniquely terrible position, because one wrong move during the dressing change could result in accusations of deliberately hurting the king, which was treason, which meant execution. Imagine having to stick tubes into an infected wound on a paranoid tyrant's leg while he's half drunk and in agony, knowing that if you cause extra pain, or if the wound gets worse, you might be blamed and lose your head. It's like playing Operation, except the buzzer is a literal executioner's axe. These servants had to maintain a careful facial expression that conveyed concern and competence without showing any disgust at the smell or appearance of the wound, because suggesting that the king's leg was revolting was probably not a career-enhancing move. They had to work quickly but carefully, be gentle but thorough, and somehow pretend that sticking their hands into a suppurating wound on a massive, irritable monarch was just another day at the office. The psychological toll on these servants must have been significant, though of course nobody bothered to record their feelings because they were just staff, and who cares about the mental health of the people elbow deep in royal pus? The infection's effect on Henry's sleep patterns created yet another layer of misery, because chronic pain and infected wounds don't respect your need for rest. Historical accounts mention that Henry often couldn't sleep through the night, partly from pain and partly because lying down would sometimes cause fluid to build up around the wound, making it worse. He would wake up in agony, demand servants attend to him immediately, and generally make everyone's life miserable, because if he couldn't sleep, nobody was sleeping. This sleep deprivation would have compounded all his other problems. Chronic pain plus sleep deprivation plus possible infection-induced delirium equals a decision-making process that would make a tired toddler look rational by comparison. His bedchamber staff worked in rotating shifts because the king might need his leg redressed at 2 in the morning, or might wake up convinced someone was trying to poison him, or might just want someone to bring him food because pain and insomnia are apparently great for building an appetite. The combination of poor sleep and constant pain would have affected his cognitive function, his emotional regulation, and his ability to process information accurately. So basically, major decisions about England's future were being made by a man who was running on 3 hours of interrupted sleep, chronic pain, and whatever infection-induced chemicals were floating around in his bloodstream. Henry's relationship with food became increasingly disordered as his mobility decreased. And we're not talking about sometimes eats his feelings disordered. We're talking about consumption levels that would alarm modern eating disorder specialists. His meals were documented because, well, everything about the king was documented, and the records are frankly astonishing. A typical dinner might include a dozen courses, multiple meat dishes including beef, mutton, pork, venison, and various game birds. Fish prepared 6 different ways, even though it wasn't Friday. Elaborate pies and pastries, custards and sweet dishes, fresh fruit when available, and enough bread to feed a small village. This wasn't occasional feast day eating. This was every single day. The psychological component here is pretty clear. Henry couldn't joust anymore, couldn't hunt like he used to, couldn't dance, couldn't do any of the physical activities that had defined him. But he could eat, and eating was one of the few pleasures left that didn't require functional legs. Food became a way to assert control when his body was spiraling out of control, a source of comfort when everything hurt, and a demonstration of wealth and power when physical demonstrations were no longer possible. The fact that the overeating made everything worse didn't seem to register, or if it did, the short-term comfort outweighed the long-term consequences, which is pretty relatable, except most of us don't have the resources to eat swan every day when we're stress eating. The medical understanding of infection in the 16th century was so completely wrong that it's almost impressive how they managed to keep Henry alive despite their best efforts to make things worse. The dominant theory was humoral medicine, which held that the body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and illness occurred when these humors were out of balance. So the treatment for an infected leg wound was to try to rebalance the humors by bleeding the patient, removing the excess blood, applying various substances to draw out the bad humors, and adjusting diet to favor certain humors over others. None of this addressed the actual problem, which was a bacterial infection that needed antibiotics that wouldn't be discovered for another 400 years. The concept of bacteria didn't exist yet. Doctors thought infections were caused by bad air or miasmas, which is why they try to treat the smell with perfumes rather than addressing the underlying infection. They had no idea that keeping the wound open and draining was actually preventing an even worse outcome, though they stumbled into that correct treatment for completely wrong reasons. It's like if someone accidentally discovered that drinking orange juice helped prevent scurvy, but thought it worked because oranges were ruled by the sun and the sun governed health. Right action, completely bonkers reasoning. The psychological phenomenon of pain catastrophizing probably played a huge role in Henry's increasingly paranoid and erratic behavior, though of course they didn't have a term for it in the 1540s. Pain catastrophizing is when chronic pain sufferers start to magnify the threat value of pain, ruminate about it constantly, and feel helpless to control it, which leads to increased anxiety, depression, and perception of pain intensity. Henry had plenty of time to ruminate, lying awake at night with his leg throbbing, thinking about how he used to be athletic and powerful, and now he was a bloated, immobile mess who smelled like death. Those thoughts would spiral. If his body could betray him like this, what about his courtiers? His wives? His advisors? If he couldn't trust his own leg to heal, how could he trust anyone else? This kind of catastrophic thinking, combined with actual power to act on paranoid impulses, led to the bloodbath of his later years. Every perceived betrayal, every slight, every moment of disrespect became magnified through the lens of a man who was constantly in pain and constantly reminded of his physical decline. When you're in agony every waking moment, your threshold for tolerating anything else drops dramatically, which is why Henry went from occasionally executing people who really did commit treason to executing people who maybe looked at him funny or whose wife he wanted to replace. The financial cost of maintaining Henry's health, or attempting to, was staggering and contributed to the economic problems that plagued England in his later years. The royal medical staff expanded dramatically as Henry's health declined, because apparently if one doctor can't fix you, clearly you need 20 doctors all trying different contradictory treatments simultaneously. These physicians were paid enormous salaries, given lodgings at court, and provided with budgets for medicines and supplies that would make modern hospital administrators weep. The cost of the gold tubes alone, because regular tubes weren't good enough for a king's festering wound, was substantial, and they had to be replaced regularly because, shockingly, shoving gold tubes into an infected wound tends to corrode them pretty quickly. Then there were the exotic ingredients for various treatments. Powdered gemstones, because grinding up rubies definitely cures leg ulcers. Imported herbs and spices, specially prepared tinctures and potions, and various animal parts that were thought to have medicinal properties. The truly absurd part is that all this money was being spent on treatments that range from completely ineffective to actively making things worse, while the actual solution, antibiotics and proper wound care, wouldn't be available for centuries. It's the medical equivalent of spending millions on essential oils when what you really need is actual medicine. Henry's attempts to maintain his public image as a strong, virile king became increasingly desperate and transparent as his condition worsened. Like watching someone try to convince you their house isn't on fire while flames are clearly visible through every window. He commissioned portraits that showed him looking powerful and imposing, with his legs positioned to hide their size and condition. He insisted on appearing at public events even when he could barely move, requiring elaborate staging to make it look like he arrived on horseback when he'd actually been carried most of the way in a litter. Court ceremonies were choreographed to minimize the distance he had to walk, with convenient chairs positioned at strategic intervals so he could sit down without making it obvious he couldn't stand for extended periods. Foreign ambassadors were carefully managed, with meetings scheduled for times when Henry was likely to be feeling relatively better, usually mornings after his wound had been freshly dressed and before the pain built up throughout the day, and the meeting rooms were arranged to show him to best advantage. It was all smoke and mirrors, an elaborate theatrical production designed to maintain the illusion of royal vigor, and everyone involved knew it was an illusion, but nobody could acknowledge it. The emperor has no clothes, except in this case the emperor can barely fit into clothes, and also his leg is rotting, but we're all going to pretend everything is fine because admitting otherwise might result in treason charges. The impact on Henry's wives during this period deserves attention. Because being married to a man whose leg is literally decomposing while he's also paranoid, in constant pain, and has absolute power over your life sounds like the worst dating profile ever created. Catherine Howard, his fifth wife, was basically a teenager when she married him. She was probably around 17 to his 49, and found herself wedded to an obese, smelly, irascible old man who could barely move and whose idea of romance involved elaborate gift-giving followed by sudden accusations of infidelity. The poor girl allegedly had affairs with younger men at court, which, if true, makes total sense, because can you imagine being a teenager forced to have sex with a nearly 50-year-old man whose leg is oozing pus and who needs mechanical assistance to get into bed? Henry's response to rumors of her infidelity was characteristically measured and reasonable. He had her executed for treason. His final wife, Catherine Parr, was essentially hired as a combination wife-nurse caregiver, chosen partly for her nursing skills and ability to manage difficult men. She had to help manage his medical care, soothe his moods, avoid triggering his paranoia, and generally act as a combination therapist-nurse-diplomat, while also fulfilling wifely duties with a man whose body was failing. She survived by being incredibly smart, incredibly patient, and incredibly lucky, outliving Henry and escaping with her head attached to her shoulders, which by that point was a significant achievement in Henry VIII's matrimonial history. The religious executions of Henry's final years took on a particularly chaotic quality, as if the king's infected leg was somehow dictating theological policy through pain-induced delirium. Between 1540 and 1547, people were executed for being too Protestant, too Catholic, not enough of either, or sometimes for reasons that seemed to have more to do with Henry's mood that day than any consistent theological position. The problem was that Henry had created a religious settlement that was basically Catholic without the Pope, but also were taking all the monastery land, but also priests can't marry, but also transubstantiation is real, but also we're printing English Bibles, a theological mess that made sense to exactly nobody, especially Henry, whose understanding of his own religious policy seemed to change based on whether his leg was having a good day or a bad day. The result was a period of religious terror where nobody knew what the correct belief was, and guessing wrong could get you burned at the stake. Some days Henry would be convinced of Protestant sympathies and would crack down on Catholics. Other days he'd swing back toward traditional doctrine, and suddenly Protestants were the problem. It was religious whiplash on a national scale, and while we can't prove that an infected leg ulcer was responsible for specific theological positions, the timing of policy shifts often correlated with documented health crises. When a monarch's decision-making process involves, what does my septic leg feel like today? As a variable, religious policy tends to get a bit unpredictable. The final years of Henry's life read like a slow-motion tragedy, where everyone knows how it ends, but has to keep pretending there's hope for recovery. By 1546, Henry was essentially immobile, requiring carrying devices to move around his palaces, and his health was clearly failing despite everyone's best efforts to pretend otherwise. His weight had ballooned to somewhere between 350 and 400 pounds on a 6'2" frame, which meant his body mass index was in the severely obese category by modern standards. The leg ulcers had spread to both legs by this point, because apparently one festering wound wasn't enough of a challenge. He suffered from what were probably repeated episodes of congestive heart failure, kidney problems from years of rich diet and possible gout, and possibly type 2 diabetes, though that wasn't diagnosed at the time. His face was described as swollen and ruddy. His breathing labored, and he needed help with basic activities like getting dressed and using the bathroom. This was the man who had once been able to dance all night and hunt all day, reduced to a bedridden invalid who could barely move without assistance. The tragedy isn't just in the physical decline, but in the fact that Henry seemed to maintain, almost until the end, the delusion that he would recover and return to his former vigor. He kept planning military campaigns, kept worrying about producing more heirs, kept behaving as if he would live forever, even as his body was obviously shutting down around him. The succession crisis that loomed over Henry's final years was made infinitely more complicated by the fact that nobody could openly discuss the king's imminent death without committing treason, which meant everyone had a plan for the future while pretending there wasn't going to be one. Henry had finally gotten his male heir with Edward VI, but Edward was only 9 years old when Henry died, which meant England would have a child king and all the political chaos that entailed. The problem was that you couldn't exactly have open meetings about what happens when the king dies, because suggesting the king might die implied he wasn't immortal and divinely protected, which was treasonous thinking. So courtiers had to engage in elaborate coded conversations and behind-the-scenes maneuvering, jockeying for position in the future regency government while maintaining the fiction that Henry would live forever and personally guide his son to adulthood. The Seymour family, as Edward's maternal relatives, were positioning themselves for power. The religious conservatives were trying to ensure a Catholic-leaning regency. The reformers were pushing for Protestant guardians, and everyone was making alliances and counter-alliances based on a future they couldn't acknowledge was coming. It was like watching people play chess in the dark while pretending they weren't playing chess at all, and the stakes were control of England's future. The contrast between Henry's self-image and reality became almost poignant in his final months. If you can feel poignant about a murderous tyrant whose legs smelled like a corpse, he still commissioned armor, even though he couldn't possibly fit into it or use it. The 1544 armor made for him had a waist circumference of 54 inches and weighed so much that it was basically a decorative object rather than functional military equipment. He still talked about leading armies personally, even though he could barely make it across a room without being carried. He still worried about his appearance and insisted on elaborate grooming rituals, even though no amount of perfume could mask the smell of infected wounds and no amount of tailoring could make him look like anything other than an obese, sick old man. There's something almost human in this desperate clinging to the memory of who he used to be, except that most people going through similar denial don't have the power to execute anyone who reminds them of reality. Henry's physicians had to walk an impossible line between providing realistic medical assessments and avoiding saying anything that might be construed as suggesting the king was anything less than robust and healthy. Your Majesty, your leg is literally rotting and you're probably going to die soon, is accurate medical advice, but also a great way to get fired and or beheaded. The manipulation of Henry in his final years by competing court factions reveals how vulnerable even absolute monarchs become when their bodies fail them. When you're in constant pain, heavily medicated with alcohol and whatever passed for painkillers in the 16th century, frequently feverish from infection, and unable to move around to verify information personally, you become dependent on the people around you for news, advice, and interpretation of events. The conservative religious faction, led by people like Bishop Gardiner and the Duke of Norfolk, try to maintain access and influence by managing Henry's medical care and controlling who could see him when. The reformist faction, including the Seymours and eventually the Parrs, counter by positioning themselves as concerned caregivers and trusted advisors. Every faction tried to time their important requests for moments when Henry was feeling relatively better and might be more amenable to their positions. Important state documents were sometimes signed when Henry was barely conscious, with his signature guided by others. Basically the 16th century equivalent of forging someone's signature on their deathbed, except technically legal, because he was sort of moving the pen himself. The level of manipulation was extraordinary, and it's unclear how much of Henry's final decisions were actually his own thoughts versus what his handlers convinced him to think while he was impaired by pain, infection, and medication. The economic devastation of Henry's later years can be directly traced to his physical decline and the psychological changes that came with it. Wars are expensive, and Henry launched several expensive military campaigns in the 1540s that accomplished virtually nothing except draining the treasury and proving that England could waste money with impressive efficiency. The war with France from 1543 to 1546 cost over £2 million, an astronomical sum that represented roughly twice the crown's annual income. Where did this money come from? Henry debased the coinage, reducing the silver content and pocketing the difference, which caused inflation and economic chaos. He sold off more monastery lands, which provided short-term cash but eliminated long-term revenue sources. He borrowed money at extortionate interest rates from European bankers. Why did he launch these wars? Partly for strategic reasons, but also because he needed to prove he was still a warrior king, still the athletic conqueror of his youth, even though he physically couldn't participate in the fighting and had a command from behind the lines while being carried around in a litter. It's the equivalent of bankrupting your family to buy a sports car when you can't physically drive anymore, except the consequences affected millions of people. The inflation and economic problems Henry created lasted well into his children's reigns, contributing to social unrest and hardship throughout England. The medicinal compounds that were shoved into or onto Henry's leg read like a list of things that definitely won't help and might make it worse, compiled by people who meant well but had absolutely no understanding of germ theory or infection control. One popular treatment involved a poultice made from bread, milk, and various herbs, which sounds like you're making breakfast for the wound. Another involved ground pearls and crushed gemstones, because apparently the medical theory was that expensive ingredients must work better, like assuming premium gas will fix a broken engine. There were animal-based remedies. Ground up earthworms, for some reason, pulverized snails, extract of viper flesh, because nothing says healing like snake juice, and various other biological materials that probably introduced new infections while failing to treat the existing one. The rose water and vinegar washes were actually among the more sensible treatments, since both have mild antiseptic properties, though not nearly enough to treat a bone infection. The tragic part is that these physicians were doing their absolute best with the knowledge available to them. They weren't stupid or malicious. They just lived in an era where medical understanding was fundamentally wrong about how bodies work. They couldn't save Henry because the tools to save him wouldn't exist for centuries. But they kept trying increasingly desperate treatments because admitting there was nothing they could do would be admitting defeat, and you don't admit defeat when treating the King of England. The isolation that chronic illness created around Henry was both physical and psychological, turning him from the gregarious young king who loved parties and company into a suspicious recluse who saw threats everywhere. When you can't move easily, you stop going places, which means people have to come to you, which means you only see the people who are allowed access by your gatekeepers, which means your information about the world becomes filtered and limited. Henry spent increasing amounts of time in his private chambers, seen only by his immediate household staff and the courtiers who managed to secure appointments. This isolation fed his paranoia because he couldn't verify information independently. If someone told him that a courtier was plotting against him, he couldn't just walk down the hall and investigate himself. He had to trust secondhand reports, which could be accurate or could be complete fabrications designed to eliminate rivals. The physical pain also made him irritable and quick to anger, which made people afraid to bring him bad news, which meant he wasn't getting accurate information about what was happening in his kingdom, which led to poor decisions based on incomplete data. It's a vicious cycle where illness creates isolation. Isolation enables manipulation. Manipulation leads to paranoia, and paranoia leads to more executions, which creates more fear, which increases isolation. By the end, Henry was essentially trapped in a prison made of his own failing body, surrounded by people who were either terrified of him or trying to use him for their own purposes. The symbolic importance of the king's physical condition can't be overstated in an era when monarchs were believed to be divinely appointed and their physical health was seen as a reflection of God's favor. If the king was strong and healthy, it meant God approved of his reign and the kingdom would prosper. If the king was sick and weak, it raised uncomfortable questions about divine favor and the legitimacy of his rule. This is why Henry's deteriorating condition was such a carefully guarded secret, with elaborate protocols to prevent common people from seeing how bad things actually were. Public appearances were staged events where Henry would be positioned to look as imposing as possible, surrounded by guards and courtiers, appearing for just long enough to be seen before being discreetly removed. The mythology of the strong, powerful king had to be maintained even as the reality crumbled, because admitting the truth would undermine the entire theoretical basis of monarchical authority. If people started thinking, our king is a rotting, immobile mess who can barely function, they might start questioning whether divine right of kings was actually a thing or just propaganda to justify hereditary dictatorship. So everyone participated in this elaborate fiction, pretending Henry was fine while his body literally fell apart, because the alternative was questioning the entire political and social structure of England. The impact on Henry's children, particularly his daughters Mary and Elizabeth, shows up in ways that influence their future reigns decades later. Mary had watched her mother, Catherine of Aragon, be cast aside and humiliated while Henry pursued and bullied. She'd seen her father transform from the charming king of her childhood into a paranoid tyrant who executed people regularly and whose mood swings were legendary. She'd been declared illegitimate, excluded from the succession, and only reinstated in her father's final years. When she eventually became queen, her religious policies and her marriage to Philip II of Spain were influenced by the trauma of watching her father's reign deteriorate along with his health. Elizabeth, whose mother was executed when she was barely 3 years old, learned even earlier that proximity to royal favor was dangerous and that you survive by being clever, adaptable, and never showing your true feelings. She watched her father go through wives like other people go through shoes, saw what happened to women who displeased him, and absorbed lessons about power, survival, and the necessity of controlling your own destiny that shaped her entire approach to queenship. Both daughters grew up in the shadow of their father's physical and mental decline, and both were profoundly affected by watching absolute power combined with failing health create a reign of terror. The medical records that survive from Henry's final months paint a picture of multiple organ systems failing simultaneously, like watching a building collapse in slow motion. His legs were massively swollen with edema, indicating probable heart failure and kidney problems. He had episodes of what were probably pulmonary edema, where fluid builds up in the lungs, causing severe breathing difficulties and a sensation of drowning. His urine output decreased, suggesting kidney failure. He had periods of confusion and disorientation, possibly from infection, pain medication, inadequate sleep, or just the general toxicity of a body that's shutting down. His appetite, always robust, finally started to fail in his last weeks, which is typically a sign that the end is near. The physicians tried everything in their considerable arsenal of useless treatments. More bleeding, more poultices, more prayers, more experimental compounds shoved into wounds that were beyond saving. By January 1547, it was clear even to the physicians that Henry was dying, though of course nobody could say this out loud. They had to maintain the fiction that the king was just temporarily indisposed and would recover soon, while simultaneously making arrangements for the succession and trying to ensure they wouldn't be blamed for his death. Being a royal physician had many perks, but potentially getting executed if your patient dies was definitely not one of them. The actual manner of Henry's death on January 28, 1547, was probably caused by a combination of factors, though the infected leg ulcers played a starring role in the final act. The most likely immediate cause was pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that breaks free from the leg veins and travels to the lungs, causing sudden death or rapid decline. This is a common complication of chronic venous ulcers, immobility, and obesity, basically the perfect storm of risk factors that Henry had been collecting for years. Alternatively, he might have died from sepsis, where the infection from his legs finally overwhelmed his immune system completely, or from heart failure, or from kidney failure, or from any combination of the above, because his body was basically a medical disaster on every level. He died at Whitehall Palace, in his bedchamber, attended by physicians who could do nothing but watch and pray. The official announcement of his death was delayed for 3 days while the transition of power was arranged, because even in death, Henry's body was a political problem that required careful management. His corpse was so heavy that it reportedly took 16 men to lift it into the coffin, and according to some accounts, the coffin split open during transport to Windsor Castle, with bodily fluids leaking out, a final, grotesque reminder of the physical decay that had defined his later years. The funeral arrangements for Henry VIII revealed the awkward challenge of maintaining royal dignity when the deceased monarch weighed somewhere between 350 and 400 pounds and had been leaking bodily fluids from multiple infected wounds right up until his death. The coffin had to be specially constructed, essentially a custom-made box large enough to accommodate what one historian delicately called the king's impressive girth, and reinforced to handle the weight without catastrophically failing. The journey from London to Windsor Castle for burial became a logistical nightmare, involving specially constructed wagons, multiple teams of horses, and very careful planning about roads that could handle the weight without collapsing. The funeral procession was meant to be a solemn, dignified affair demonstrating the majesty and power of the Tudor monarchy, but it was somewhat undermined by the practical reality of transporting what was essentially a very large, very dead body in an era without refrigeration or modern embalming techniques. The story that Henry's coffin burst open and dogs licked up the leaking fluids is probably apocryphal or exaggerated, but the fact that the story exists and was repeated tells you something about how thoroughly his physical condition had become part of his legend. Even in death, Henry couldn't escape the consequences of his rotting legs and failed body. The psychological autopsy of Henry's final decade reveals a man whose personality was fundamentally altered by chronic pain, infection, and physical limitation in ways that shaped English history. Modern medical professionals who've studied his case believe he was suffering from chronic pain syndrome, depression, possible traumatic brain injury from the 1536 jousting accident, and periodic episodes of infection-induced delirium. This wasn't just the king was grumpy because his leg hurt. This was profound neurological and psychological changes caused by years of unrelenting physical trauma. Chronic pain literally rewires your brain, changing how you process information, regulate emotions, and relate to other people. The paranoia, mood swings, impulsivity, and violent rages that characterize Henry's later years aren't just personality flaws. They're symptoms of a brain and body under constant assault. The tragedy is that everyone around him had to treat these symptoms as if they were rational decisions made by a sound mind, because suggesting otherwise would be treason. So when Henry decided to execute someone because his pain-addled, infection-fevered brain convinced him of a conspiracy that didn't exist, everyone had to pretend it was a reasonable response to actual treason rather than the paranoid delusion of a very sick man. The religious legacy of Henry's reign was particularly complicated by the fact that his theological positions seemed to shift based partly on political necessity and partly on what his infected leg was doing that particular week. The Church of England that emerged from Henry's break with Rome was a weird hybrid that satisfied almost nobody. Too Catholic for the Protestants, too Protestant for the Catholics, and lacking any coherent theological foundation beyond whatever the king says is correct. This religious ambiguity created problems that lasted for generations, leading to the religious conflicts of Edward VI's reign, the Catholic Restoration under Mary I, the Protestant settlement under Elizabeth I, and eventually contributing to the English Civil War in the 1640s. You can draw a direct line from Henry's infected leg to the execution of Charles I a century later, because Henry's physical decline prevented him from establishing a stable religious settlement or grooming a strong successor. Instead, he left a 9-year-old king, a religiously divided nation, a bankrupt treasury, and a legacy of terror that made everyone paranoid about royal favor. If Henry had died in 1536 before the jousting accident, he probably would have been remembered as a somewhat controversial but generally successful Renaissance monarch. Instead, his last decade of physical decay and psychological deterioration defined his entire legacy. The economic consequences of Henry's spending during his decline continued to plague England long after his death, creating social unrest and hardship that his children's governments struggled to address. The debasement of the coinage that Henry implemented to fund his wars caused inflation that hit ordinary people hardest. Bread prices rose, wages didn't keep up, and the purchasing power of savings evaporated. The dissolution of the monasteries eliminated important social services that monasteries had provided, including hospitals, schools, and poor relief, without establishing adequate replacements. The land sales from dissolved monasteries created a new class of wealthy gentry, but also displaced thousands of people who had depended on monastic lands for their livelihoods. The debts Henry accumulated had to be serviced by his successors, draining resources that could have been used for governance or public works. All of this economic chaos can be traced back to Henry's desperate need to prove he was still powerful and relevant despite his physical limitations, combined with his declining judgment as pain and infection affected his decision-making. It's the fiscal equivalent of maxing out every credit card to buy things you don't need because you're having a midlife crisis, except the bill gets passed to your children and millions of other people who had no say in your terrible decisions. The medical establishment's complete failure to help Henry, through no real fault of their own, highlights the terrifying vulnerability of pre-modern medicine when faced with conditions that required antibiotics or surgical interventions that wouldn't be developed for centuries. The best physicians in Europe attended Henry, using treatments based on the most advanced medical theory available, and they achieved absolutely nothing except possibly making him more comfortable occasionally. They couldn't prevent the initial wound from becoming chronically infected. They couldn't cure the infection once established. They couldn't manage the pain effectively. They couldn't prevent the secondary complications like blood poisoning, heart failure, and kidney problems. They were basically helpless spectators watching their patients slowly deteriorate, trying treatment after treatment that did nothing, while being unable to acknowledge that nothing they did would make any real difference. The frustration must have been immense, especially knowing that failure could be interpreted as incompetence or even malice, potentially resulting in professional ruin or worse. This wasn't medical malpractice in the modern sense. It was the tragedy of living in an era where the medical knowledge and tools necessary to treat the condition simply didn't exist and wouldn't exist for hundreds of years. The contrast between Henry's public persona and private reality became most stark in his final years, when maintaining the fiction of royal power required increasingly elaborate staging and increasingly willing suspension of disbelief from everyone involved. Public documents still referred to the king's grace and majesty and his vigor in defending the realm, at a time when he couldn't walk unassisted and needed mechanical devices to move between rooms. Foreign ambassadors sent reports describing the king's health in carefully coded language, because directly stating this man is obviously dying would be diplomatically problematic and potentially dangerous if the reports were intercepted. Courtiers developed an entire vocabulary of euphemisms. The king was indisposed rather than incapacitated, resting rather than bedridden, conserving his strength rather than too weak to function. The gap between rhetoric and reality became so vast that it was almost satirical, like watching a play where everyone is acting as if the emperor's new clothes are magnificent while he's obviously naked and also on fire. The English people knew something was wrong with their king, but the exact details were carefully concealed, creating rumors and speculation that were sometimes more alarming than the truth. This culture of secrecy and euphemism around royal health would continue through subsequent reigns, establishing a precedent that monarchical infirmity was a state secret rather than public information. The impact on medical practice and royal health management after Henry's death was surprisingly minimal, because apparently nobody learned much from watching the king slowly rot to death despite the best efforts of the most expensive physicians in Europe. Subsequent monarchs continued to be treated with the same useless poultices, the same bloodletting, the same humoral theory-based interventions that had failed so spectacularly with Henry. The gold tubes that had been shoved into his leg wounds didn't become a cautionary tale about medical futility. Instead, they became part of the legend of Henry's grandeur, because even his medical treatments were made of gold. The lesson that should have been learned, that chronic wounds require proper cleaning, infection control, and possibly surgical intervention, wasn't learned because the germ theory of disease wouldn't be developed until the 1860s. Instead, the takeaway seemed to be, well, Henry was old and fat, so obviously he died. Nothing to be done about it. Completely missing the point that his death was the culmination of 11 years of progressive decline from infected wound that was mismanaged from the start. Future monarchs would continue to receive terrible medical care based on incorrect theories, dying of treatable conditions, until medical science finally caught up with reality sometime in the late 19th century. The psychological trauma inflicted on Henry's household staff, physicians, and close attendants during his final years deserved consideration, even though their suffering was considered irrelevant compared to royal concerns. Imagine being a groom of the stool, whose job literally involved assisting the king with toilet functions and managing his leg wound care, watching a human being slowly decompose while alive, dealing with the smell and the fluids and the constant pain-induced rages, and knowing that any mistake or perceived slight could result in accusations of attempted murder. The physicians who attended Henry daily saw their patient deteriorating despite their best efforts, faced criticism for their failures, lived in fear of being blamed for the king's inevitable death, and had to maintain confident optimism in public while privately knowing nothing they did would work. The servants who carried him, dressed him, fed him, and cleaned up after him witnessed the most intimate details of royal decline while being treated as invisible and disposable. Some of these people spent years in this environment of physical horror and psychological terror, and we have almost no records of their experiences or how they coped with the trauma. They're the forgotten victims of Henry's decline, people whose lives were consumed by catering to a dying tyrant's needs while receiving no acknowledgement or support for the psychological toll of that service. The succession of Edward VI as a 9-year-old king was directly shaped by Henry's physical and mental decline, because Henry's deteriorating judgment in his final years affected his arrangements for his son's regency. The succession was supposed to be managed by a balanced council of advisors representing different religious and political factions. But Henry's final will was possibly influenced or even altered by people who had access to him when he was barely conscious and certainly not in any condition to make complex political decisions. Edward Seymour, who became Lord Protector and essentially ruled England during Edward's minority, was positioned for power partly through his sister Jane's connection as Edward's mother and partly through careful management of access to Henry in his final months. Whether Henry actually intended for Seymour to have as much power as he seized, or whether the regency arrangements were manipulated by factions taking advantage of a dying king's impaired judgment, remains a historical debate. What's clear is that Henry's physical condition in his last year made him vulnerable to manipulation in ways that affected the governance of England for years after his death. A stronger, healthier Henry might have made different arrangements or been more careful about balance of power, but the man who actually made these decisions was in constant pain, frequently feverish, and probably not thinking clearly about long-term consequences. The cultural memory of Henry VIII has been shaped as much by his physical decline as by his 6 wives or his break with Rome, because there's something simultaneously fascinating and repulsive about watching power and physical decay collide in one person. We remember Henry as the bloated, paranoid tyrant of his later years more than the athletic Renaissance prince of his youth, partly because his decline was so dramatic and partly because his worst actions occurred during his physical deterioration. The popular image of Henry, massive, menacing, unpredictable, surrounded by executed wives and courtiers, is fundamentally the image of Henry in decline. Henry with the rotting leg, Henry whose body betrayed him and took his sanity along for the ride. This creates a somewhat distorted historical picture, because it obscures the fact that for the first half of his reign, Henry was actually a fairly conventional Renaissance monarch who was popular, relatively moderate, and generally competent. But chronic pain and physical decay transformed him into something else entirely. And that transformation is what we remember. It's a cautionary tale about how physical health affects, mental health affects, decision-making affects history, all wrapped up in a package that includes festering wounds, gold drainage tubes, and enough pus to traumatize an entire palace staff. The final irony of Henry's leg situation is that the wound that caused so much suffering and influenced so much history was completely preventable, the result of a middle-aged man refusing to accept that he wasn't young anymore and shouldn't be jousting. If Henry had retired from jousting at 40, or even just accepted that 44 was too old to be charging at people with lances while wearing 120 pounds of armor, he might have lived another decade or two as a relatively healthy monarch, made better decisions, avoided some of the worst excesses of his paranoid period, and left England in much better shape than he actually did. Instead, his need to prove he was still the athletic king of his youth led to an accident that destroyed his health, changed his personality, influenced his policies, and shaped English history for generations. The jousting accident was peak toxic masculinity, refusing to acknowledge physical limitations, prioritizing ego over safety, and creating devastating consequences that affected millions of people. One stupid decision on a tournament field in 1536 led to 11 years of progressive physical and mental decline that culminated in religious terror, fiscal disaster, and political instability. It's almost impressive how much damage one infected leg wound could cause, like watching a historical domino effect, where the first domino is king falls off horse, and the last domino is decades of religious warfare and economic chaos. The process of embalming Henry's body after death presented challenges that medieval mortuary practices were absolutely not equipped to handle, given that they were working with what was essentially a 400-pound corpse that had been leaking fluids from multiple infected wounds right up until the moment of death. Embalming in the 16th century was a crude process involving removing internal organs, packing the body cavity with herbs and spices, and wrapping everything in cerecloth, basically waxed linen that was supposed to preserve the body and contain any unpleasant leakage. With Henry, the embalmers were facing a body that had been systematically breaking down for years, with infected tissue, compromised circulation, and God knows what kind of bacterial colonies that had been throwing parties in his leg ulcers for over a decade. The amount of preservative materials required would have been substantial, and even then, success was far from guaranteed. The embalmers probably earned every penny of their fee, and then some, dealing with a corpse that was challenging under the best circumstances and absolutely nightmarish under actual circumstances. There's a reason medieval people were terrified of handling dead bodies. They didn't understand disease transmission, but they correctly intuited that corpses, especially diseased corpses, were dangerous and best handled quickly and carefully. The political maneuvering that occurred during Henry's final illness and immediately after his death demonstrates how vulnerable absolute monarchy becomes when a monarch is physically incapacitated and unable to enforce his will directly. The conservative religious faction, led by Bishop Gardiner and the Duke of Norfolk, found themselves outmaneuvered by the reformist faction despite having been in favor for much of Henry's later reign. Why? Because they lost control of physical access to Henry in his final weeks. And in a system where power flows directly from the monarch's person, physical proximity is everything. Edward Seymour and his allies managed to position themselves as the people who controlled access to the dying king, which meant they controlled information flow, document signing, and ultimately the transition of power. Norfolk was arrested on treason charges literally days before Henry died, in what was clearly a preemptive strike to eliminate a powerful conservative voice from the Regency Council. The fact that Norfolk survived only because Henry died before signing the execution warrant shows how close the political knife-fighting got. All of this chaos stemmed from Henry's physical incapacity, creating a power vacuum that rival factions rushed to fill, with the future of England's religious and political direction hanging in the balance, while Henry lay dying, probably too out of it to understand what was happening around him. The myth-making around Henry's death began almost immediately, with various factions trying to claim that the dying king had said or done things that supported their positions, and nobody could verify anything because the actual witnesses were carefully controlled. Protestant reformers claimed Henry had embraced reformist theology on his deathbed and expressed regret for not reforming further. Conservative Catholics claimed he had reaffirmed traditional doctrine and warned against Protestant innovation. The truth is probably that Henry, feverish and dying, said confused and contradictory things that people interpreted however they wanted, like a theological Rorschach test. The delay in announcing his death, 3 days between his actual death and the public announcement, gave the Seymour faction time to consolidate power and control the narrative. By the time the English people learned their king was dead, the succession was already managed. Edward VI was already under Seymour control, and the direction of the new reign was already determined. Henry's physical decline in his final days created a window of opportunity for political manipulation that shaped England's immediate future. and his inability to maintain control even over the circumstances of his own death shows how completely physical incapacity undermines even absolute power. The economic state Henry left to his son was catastrophic, and while some of that can be attributed to General Tudor financial mismanagement, a substantial portion was directly due to Henry's spending during his period of physical decline and impaired judgment. The wars of the 1540s had cost over £2 million, roughly 6 years of ordinary royal revenue, and accomplished basically nothing strategically. The coinage debasement had created inflation that was eroding purchasing power and would take years to correct. The crown lands had been sold off to raise quick cash, eliminating long-term revenue sources. The debts to foreign bankers carried interest rates that consumed a significant portion of annual income just to service. Edward VI's government inherited this fiscal disaster and had to somehow manage it while also dealing with the religious changes, political factions, and social unrest that were also part of Henry's legacy. It's like inheriting a house where the previous owner maxed out every credit card, took out multiple mortgages, sold off everything valuable, and also set fire to several rooms on his way out. The fiscal consequences of Henry's decline affected English governance and society for decades, contributing to the social unrest of the mid-16th century and the constant financial crises that plagued Edward and Mary's reigns. The medical knowledge gained from Henry's case was essentially zero, because nobody thought to actually study what had happened or why treatments failed, instead just accepting that the king got sick and died, without any systematic analysis. The detailed records of his symptoms, treatments, and progression of illness could have been valuable for developing better understanding of chronic wounds, infection, and disease progression, but medical science in the 1540s wasn't set up for that kind of systematic learning. Physicians didn't compare notes across cases, didn't track treatment outcomes, didn't test whether interventions actually worked, and didn't question the fundamental assumptions of humoral theory, even when those assumptions repeatedly failed to produce results. So all the information about Henry's case, 11 years of detailed daily observations of a chronic wound infection, was basically wasted from a medical advancement perspective. Future patients with similar conditions would receive the same useless treatments based on the same incorrect theories, because nobody learned anything from Henry's failure to respond to those treatments. It's frustrating from a modern perspective to see this complete absence of evidence-based learning, but it's also a reminder that systematic medical science is a relatively recent development. And for most of human history, medical knowledge advanced at a glacial pace or not at all. The psychological impact on Henry's children of watching their father's decline manifested in different ways that shaped their future reigns and personal lives. Edward VI, who spent his formative years watching his father transform into an immobile, rage-prone tyrant, developed an almost obsessive focus on religious reform and personal piety, possibly as a reaction to his father's theological chaos and moral failings. Mary I's reign was marked by her determination to undo everything her father had done religiously, burning Protestants with an enthusiasm that earned her the nickname Bloody Mary, driven partly by her loyalty to her mother's memory and her hatred of the religious changes that had enabled her parents' divorce. Elizabeth I learned the most functional lessons, developing the political flexibility and emotional control that let her survive and eventually thrive, understanding that absolute certainty and rigid positions led to the kind of catastrophic decision-making she'd watched her father demonstrate. She also notably never married, possibly because she'd watched what happened to her father's wives and decided that remaining single and in complete control of her own fate was vastly preferable to giving any man power over her. All three of Henry's children were profoundly shaped by their father's decline, and their reigns reflect different responses to the trauma of growing up in the shadow of a decomposing tyrant. The servants and attendants who survived Henry's reign and continued into Edward's faced a weird kind of institutional trauma, having spent years in an environment of physical horror and political terror that suddenly ended with Henry's death. The people who had dressed his wounds, carried his body, managed his rages, and lived in fear of his paranoid accusations suddenly found themselves serving a 9-year-old boy and his regency council. The psychological adjustment must have been significant. Going from tiptoeing around a murderous tyrant whose mood could shift from jovial to homicidal in seconds, to serving a child king who was actually relatively gentle and scholarly. Some of these servants had been with Henry for decades, watching his transformation from the athletic young king to the rotting old tyrant, and they carried memories of both versions, plus everything in between. Their institutional knowledge about how the household functioned, how to manage royal health crises, and how to navigate court politics was valuable, but it came with psychological baggage. How do you decompress from years of trauma when nobody acknowledges that what you experienced was traumatic? The answer is probably that you don't. You just keep functioning and don't talk about it, which was basically the 16th century approach to all psychological problems. The religious settlement that emerged from the chaos of Henry's reign was unstable precisely because Henry's declining judgment prevented him from establishing anything coherent or sustainable. He broke from Rome, but maintained Catholic theology. He dissolved monasteries, but kept most Catholic practices. He allowed English Bibles, but punished people for reading them wrong. He executed people for being too Protestant and for being too Catholic, sometimes on the same day. The result was a religious landscape that satisfied nobody and created competing factions that would fight for dominance for the next century. Edward's reign swung hard toward Protestantism. Mary swung back to Catholicism. And Elizabeth finally established a compromise that still left everyone somewhat unhappy, but at least stopped the constant religious whiplash. All of this religious chaos, which contributed to social division, political instability, and eventually civil war, can be traced back to Henry's inability to establish a stable settlement, which was largely due to his declining health affecting his judgment and his constant need to shift positions based on political expediency and personal whim. If your religious policy is determined partly by which faction has the king's ear on any given day, and the king's mental state varies based on whether his leg is actively trying to kill him that morning, you're going to end up with an incoherent mess that creates problems for generations. The comparison between Henry's death and modern celebrity health crises reveals some interesting parallels and differences, because the fundamental dynamics of power, physical decline, and public image management haven't changed that much, even if the medical technology has improved dramatically. Modern celebrities and political leaders still try to hide health problems, still surround themselves with yes men who won't deliver bad news, still make increasingly poor decisions as their health declines, and still create succession chaos when they fail to prepare adequately for their incapacity or death. The difference is that modern medicine can actually treat infections, manage chronic pain with effective medications, and generally keep people alive and functional much longer than 16th century medicine could. Henry, with modern medical care, would have had his leg infection treated with antibiotics after the initial jousting injury. Probably would have needed surgery to debride infected tissue and possibly pin broken bones. Would have been prescribed actual pain medication instead of just alcohol. Would have been strongly encouraged to lose weight and exercise within his limitations. And might have lived another 20 years as a relatively healthy monarch. But even with all that medical intervention, the psychological and behavioral patterns that made him vulnerable to poor decision-making would still be there. The ego that made him joust at 44, the inability to accept limitations, the tendency toward paranoia and rage, the need to prove his virility and power. Modern medicine could have treated his leg, but it couldn't have fixed his personality. The legacy of Henry's physical decline extends far beyond his immediate reign, influencing how we think about power, health, and decision-making even today. The image of the bloated tyrant, isolated by his own body's failures, making increasingly paranoid and violent decisions while his kingdom suffers, has become an archetypal warning about what happens when absolute power meets physical and mental decline. We see echoes of Henry's story in every aging dictator who refuses to step down, every leader whose declining health affects their judgment, every powerful person whose physical limitations are hidden from public view until they can't be hidden anymore. The specific details are different. We have better medicine now. Democratic systems theoretically provide checks on power. Information is harder to completely control, but the fundamental dynamics remain surprisingly similar. Henry's rotting leg is a metaphor for what happens when power becomes so concentrated that one person's physical and mental health becomes a matter of national importance. And when that person's decline is hidden or denied until the consequences become catastrophic. It's a story about hubris, decay, and the inability to accept human limitations, which makes it eternally relevant, even though the actual events happened nearly 500 years ago. The final chapter of Henry VIII's decline is ultimately a story about the fundamental incompatibility between absolute monarchical power and human physical vulnerability, played out with gruesome medical details and devastating historical consequences. Here was a man who claimed to rule by divine right, whose word was literally law, who could order executions with a gesture and change the national religion on a whim, brought low by an infected leg wound that all his power couldn't heal. The disconnect between his theoretical omnipotence and his practical helplessness created a cognitive dissonance that everyone had to navigate carefully. Acknowledging that the king needed help without suggesting he was weak, treating his medical condition while maintaining the fiction of his invincibility, preparing for his death while pretending he would live forever. This same dynamic plays out in authoritarian systems throughout history, where the leader's human vulnerabilities become state secrets and potential crises. Henry's leg was a state secret that everyone knew about but couldn't discuss, a physical reality that couldn't be acknowledged officially even as it shaped every aspect of governance. The lesson, if there is one, is that bodies eventually fail regardless of power or privilege, and systems that depend on one person's physical and mental capacity are inherently fragile and prone to catastrophic failure when that capacity inevitably declines. The immediate aftermath of Henry's death revealed just how much his physical presence had been holding together a fundamentally unstable political system through sheer intimidation and the threat of violence. Within days of his death, the carefully balanced council he'd supposedly established was completely bypassed as Edward Seymour seized power and declared himself Lord Protector with near absolute authority. The religious conservatives who had been dominant in Henry's final years found themselves suddenly marginalized or arrested. The moderate religious settlement that Henry had tried to maintain, Catholic theology without papal authority, immediately began shifting toward Protestant reform. It's almost like the entire political structure had been frozen in place by Henry's terrifying presence. And the moment he died, everything melted and reformed into new patterns. The speed of these changes shows that Henry's declining health in his final years hadn't just affected his personal decision-making. It had created a power vacuum that rival factions were preparing to fill the moment he died. Everyone had been planning for the post-Henry era while pretending Henry would live forever. And the instant he was gone, those plans activated with remarkable speed. His physical decline had been visible for years, giving ambitious courtiers plenty of time to position themselves, build alliances, and prepare their moves for the succession. The wealth that Henry consumed during his reign on medical care, comfort, and attempting to maintain his lifestyle despite his physical limitations represents a staggering misallocation of resources that had real consequences for ordinary people. The gold drainage tubes alone, replaced regularly because infection and bodily fluids corroded them, cost more than most of his subjects would earn in their entire lifetimes. The exotic medicinal ingredients, the constant physician consultations, the mechanical devices for moving his enormous body around the palaces, the specially constructed furniture and doors, the servants dedicated entirely to his personal care. All of this required money that came from taxes, land sales, and debasing the currency. Meanwhile, ordinary English people were dealing with inflation, unemployment from the dissolution of monasteries, and economic disruption from Henry's wars. The contrast between the resources poured into one man's feudal medical care and the lack of resources available for addressing actual social problems is stark. Henry's leg ulcer received the attention of the best physicians in Europe in treatments involving crushed pearls and powdered gemstones, while English peasants with similar infections just died because they couldn't afford any medical care at all. It's a perfect illustration of how inequality in pre-modern societies meant that resources flowed upward to the already powerful, while ordinary people's suffering was considered irrelevant. The historiographical debate about Henry's personality change, whether he was always a tyrant who just had more opportunity to express it in his later years, or whether his physical decline genuinely transformed him from a relatively benign ruler into a paranoid monster, is complicated by the fact that we can't separate his political decisions from his physical condition. Young Henry did execute people, but they were generally people who had actually committed treason or posed genuine threats to his rule. Old Henry executed people for vague suspicions, imagined conspiracies, or just because they annoyed him. Young Henry made strategic decisions about warfare and diplomacy that mostly made sense within his political context. Old Henry launched expensive wars that accomplished nothing except making him feel powerful. Young Henry was charming, witty, and enjoyed intellectual discourse. Old Henry was short-tempered, suspicious, and prone to violent outbursts. The question is whether this change was inevitable personality development, or whether chronic pain, infection, and possible brain damage from the jousting accident genuinely altered who he was at a fundamental level. Modern neuroscience supports the idea that chronic pain and traumatic brain injury can cause lasting personality changes, but we can't exactly give Henry a brain skinned 500 years after his death. What we can say is that the timing of his personality shift correlates strongly with his physical decline, which suggests causation even if we can't prove it definitively. The impact of Henry's physical condition on his artistic and cultural patronage in his later years shows another dimension of how illness affected his reign. Young Henry was a serious patron of the arts, commissioning music, supporting writers, bringing continental artists to England, and generally trying to make his court a center of Renaissance culture comparable to France or Italy. Old Henry still commissioned artwork, but it was increasingly focused on propaganda. Portraits showing him as more imposing and healthier than he actually was, architecture demonstrating his power and magnificence, and less support for the kind of experimental or innovative work that had characterized his early reign. When you're in constant pain and increasingly paranoid, you become less interested in abstract aesthetic questions and more interested in controlling your image and demonstrating power. The cultural flowering that had occurred in the 1510s and 1520s gave way to a more rigid, controlled, propagandistic approach in the 1540s. This wasn't just about aging or changing tastes. It reflected Henry's psychological state as chronic illness made him more defensive, more concerned with legacy, and less open to the kind of creative risk-taking that produces great art. The irony is that the portraits we remember most, the imposing, larger-than-life images of Henry in his later years, are essentially propaganda designed to hide the reality of a dying man, and yet they become the definitive image of Henry VIII in popular imagination. The medical ethics, or complete lack thereof, in treating Henry raise questions that remain relevant today about consent, patient autonomy, and treatment of powerful people. Henry's physicians couldn't refuse to treat him, couldn't tell him his prognosis honestly, couldn't recommend lifestyle changes that might offend him, and couldn't quit even when their treatments were clearly failing. They were essentially medical prisoners, forced to provide care under impossible constraints while facing execution if their patient died, or even just if he decided they weren't trying hard enough. This created perverse incentives where physicians had to appear confident and optimistic regardless of reality, had to keep trying increasingly desperate treatments even when they clearly weren't working, and had to prioritize the king's emotional comfort over honest medical advice. Modern medical ethics emphasizes informed consent, honest communication, and patient autonomy. But how do those principles work when your patient is an absolute monarch who can have you killed for giving him bad news? The answer is they don't work at all, which is why treating royalty was both prestigious and potentially fatal. The same dynamics play out today when treating powerful people, politicians, celebrities, wealthy individuals who are surrounded by yes men and who react badly to honest medical advice. The specifics change, but the fundamental problem of providing good medical care to people who don't want to hear the truth remains constant. The symbolic castration represented by Henry's physical decline, his inability to hunt, joust, dance, or perform sexually as he had in his youth, probably drove much of his increasingly desperate need to demonstrate power through executions and military campaigns. In a culture where masculine identity was heavily tied to physical prowess and sexual performance, Henry's transformation from athletic king to a mobile invalid represented a profound loss of masculine status that he tried to compensate for through displays of political and military power. He couldn't prove his manhood through tournaments anymore, so he proved it by ordering executions. He couldn't demonstrate virility through multiple sexual partners, though he tried, marrying 6 times despite his physical condition, making sex increasingly difficult and unpleasant for everyone involved. So he demonstrated it through the power to decide who lived and who died. The younger wives he pursued in his later years. Catherine Howard was probably 17 when she married 49-year-old Henry, were attempts to reclaim the sexual virility that his rotting leg and obesity had destroyed. The fact that these marriages ended badly reflects partly that teenage girls don't generally find obese, smelly, impotent old men attractive, regardless of how many crowns they're wearing. Henry's physical decline emasculated him in ways that his culture considered fundamental to male identity, and his increasingly violent and erratic behavior was partly a response to that psychological wound on top of his physical wounds. The preventive lessons from Henry's case are clear from a modern perspective, but were completely invisible to his contemporaries. Athletic activities have age-appropriate limits. Injuries require proper rest and rehabilitation. Chronic wounds need aggressive infection control. Obesity exacerbates all health problems. And chronic pain requires proper management, including psychological support. If Henry had followed modern medical advice after his 1536 jousting accident, rest completely until healed, aggressive infection control with antibiotics, physical therapy to restore function, pain management with appropriate medications, psychological counseling to deal with the trauma and lifestyle changes, and dietary modifications to prevent weight gain, he probably would have recovered reasonably well and lived another 20 years as a functional monarch. Instead, he got treatments based on humoral theory that did nothing, continued his sedentary lifestyle while eating enormous quantities of food, self-medicated with alcohol, and received no psychological support for dealing with chronic pain and disability. The result was 11 years of progressive decline, culminating in death, and a reign marked by increasingly poor decisions influenced by pain, infection, and deteriorating mental health. The tragedy is that all of this was preventable with knowledge and tools that wouldn't exist for centuries, making Henry's suffering and the consequences of his decline completely inevitable given the era he lived in. The dynastic consequences of Henry's physical decline extend beyond his immediate children to shape English monarchy for generations. His obsessive need for a male heir, driven partly by his declining health making him desperate to secure the succession before death, led to 3 different marriages after Jane Seymour gave him Edward VI. This obsession created the succession crisis he was trying to avoid because Edward was sickly and died young. Mary was Catholic and had no children, and Elizabeth's legitimacy was questionable in some eyes due to her mother's controversial execution. If Henry had been healthy and had reasonable expectations of living another 20 years, he might have been less desperate about the succession and made better decisions about marriages and religious policy. Instead, his awareness of his own declining health and likely early death created urgency that led to rushed decisions and political chaos. The Tudor dynasty ended with Elizabeth I partly because Henry's need to produce male heirs at any cost created the very succession problems he was trying to prevent. It's historical irony at its finest. The king's desperate attempts to ensure dynastic stability through multiple marriages and break with Rome actually destabilized everything and contributed to the dynasty's eventual extinction. The comparison between Henry's situation and modern leaders' health crises highlights how little has fundamentally changed about the dynamics of power and physical decline despite massive advances in medical technology. We still see political leaders hiding health problems from the public, still see powerful people receiving treatment that prioritizes maintaining function and image over honest assessment of limitations. still see decision-making affected by undisclosed illness and pain, and still see succession crises when leaders haven't adequately prepared for their incapacity or death. The main difference is that modern medicine can manage conditions better and keep people functioning longer, which sometimes makes the problem worse by allowing impaired leaders to remain in power longer than they should. Henry's decline was relatively quick, 11 years from injury to death. While modern politicians can linger for years or even decades with conditions that significantly impair their judgment, while medical intervention keeps them alive. The question of when physical or mental decline should disqualify someone from power remains contentious and unresolved, partly because we haven't developed good systems for managing the transition when powerful people become incapable of fulfilling their roles. Henry's case is an extreme historical example, but the fundamental issues it raises about power, health, and governance remain entirely relevant today. The everyday indignities of Henry's condition, needing help to dress, being carried upstairs, requiring assistance with basic bodily functions, enduring the stares and whispered comments of courtiers, smelling his own infected wounds, and knowing everyone else could smell them too, must have been psychologically devastating for someone whose entire identity was wrapped up in being powerful and impressive. There's something almost tragic about imagining Henry lying awake at night, remembering when he could vault onto a horse in full armor or dance until dawn, while his current reality involved needing 4 men to hoist him into bed and try to ignore the smell of his own decay. This contrast between memory and reality, between who he had been and who he became, probably drove much of his rage and paranoia in his final years. Every interaction reminded him of what he'd lost. Every time servants struggled to move him. Every time a doorway had to be widened to accommodate his bulk. Every time someone's face betrayed their disgust at the smell, it reinforced his decline and helplessness. The psychological torture of being trapped in a failing body while remembering your former capabilities is something modern medicine is just beginning to understand and address. But Henry had no framework for processing these feelings except rage, denial, and projecting his frustration onto others through violence and cruelty. The ultimate irony of Henry VIII's reign is that history remembers him primarily for his wives and his break with Rome, when the single most influential factor in his decision-making during the last third of his reign was probably a festering wound in his leg that wouldn't heal. We remember the 6 marriages, the executed wives, the religious revolution, the dissolution of the monasteries, and the creation of the Church of England, but we tend to forget that many of these decisions were made by a man who was in constant agony, frequently feverish from infection, possibly suffering from brain damage, and whose judgment was progressively impaired by chronic illness. The great religious and political changes of Henry's reign weren't just the result of theological conviction or political calculation. They were partly the result of a king whose rotting leg was poisoning his body and mind, making him increasingly paranoid, impulsive, and violent. English history was shaped by an infected leg ulcer, which is both absurd and terrifying when you think about the implications. How many other historical events were influenced by undisclosed or poorly managed health conditions of powerful people? How many wars, persecutions, and political disasters can be traced back to a leader whose pain or illness affected their judgment at critical moments? Henry's case is just the most well-documented example of a phenomenon that has probably influenced history far more than we acknowledge. The scientific analysis of Henry's remains, or rather the lack thereof, represents a missed opportunity for understanding both his specific condition and Renaissance health more broadly. Henry was buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle in a vault alongside Jane Seymour, and his coffin has never been officially opened for modern examination. If researchers could examine his skeletal remains today, they could potentially identify the extent of bone infection in his legs, look for signs of traumatic brain injury from the jousting accident, analyze bone density and nutritional markers, and possibly even recover DNA for genetic analysis. Modern forensic pathology could answer questions about whether he had diabetes, what specific bacteria caused his infections, whether he showed signs of other systemic diseases, and how severe his obesity actually was based on skeletal structure. But Henry rests in what's considered consecrated ground, and there's significant resistance to disturbing royal remains for scientific study, even when the potential knowledge gain would be substantial. It's frustrating from a historical and medical perspective that we have this incredibly well-documented case of chronic illness affecting a major historical figure, but we can't examine the physical evidence to confirm our theories or learn more about Renaissance disease patterns. Henry's body could teach us things about 16th century health, nutrition, infection, and medical treatment, but instead it remains sealed in a vault, keeping its secrets for eternity, or at least until attitudes about examining historical remains change significantly. The linguistic evidence of Henry's decline appears in his later correspondence, where his writing style changes noticeably from the articulate, often witty letters of his youth to shorter, more confused, and sometimes nearly incoherent documents in his final years. Handwriting analysis shows increasing shakiness and difficulty with fine motor control, which could indicate neurological problems from infection, poor circulation, or the effects of chronic pain on concentration and coordination. The content of his letters becomes more repetitive, more focused on perceived slights and betrayals, and less engaged with complex political or theological arguments. Modern neuropsychologists looking at these documents see patterns consistent with cognitive decline from multiple causes: chronic pain affecting executive function, possible traumatic brain injury effects, infection-induced delirium becoming more frequent, and the general mental fog that comes from years of poor sleep and constant physical distress. Henry's later letters read like they were written by a different person than the young king, who composed love poetry and theological treatises. And while some of that is normal aging, the degree of change suggests pathological processes beyond typical age-related decline. The tragedy is that nobody around him could acknowledge this cognitive deterioration without committing treason, so they had to treat increasingly confused and paranoid directives as if they were rational policy decisions from a sound mind. The architectural legacy of Henry's physical decline is literally built into the palaces he modified to accommodate his increasing immobility, with wider doorways, ramps instead of stairs where possible, and structural changes to allow for mechanical lifting devices. Hampton Court Palace and Whitehall Palace were both modified extensively in Henry's later years to make them navigable for a man who couldn't walk more than short distances and needed mechanical assistance for vertical movement. Some of these modifications still exist today, physical evidence of how one man's disability reshaped royal architecture. There's something poignant about these permanent structural changes made to accommodate a temporary resident who eventually died anyway, leaving behind doorways that are slightly too wide and ramps that serve no purpose except as reminders of a king who could no longer climb stairs. These architectural modifications also represented enormous expense. Construction projects that diverted resources and labor from more productive uses, all to make a dying man slightly more comfortable in his final years. Future residents of these palaces inherited the structural changes without the context, walking through doors widened for a rotting tyrant, using ramps built for mechanical hoists, and generally moving through spaces shaped by one man's physical limitations long after those limitations ceased to matter. The pharmaceutical history that might have been learned from Henry's case was completely wasted because nobody in the 16th century was conducting anything resembling controlled trials or systematic observation of treatment effectiveness. Physicians tried hundreds of different compounds on Henry's wounds over 11 years, and if anyone had been tracking which ones seemed to help, which ones made things worse, and which ones did nothing, they could have advanced medical knowledge considerably. Instead, each physician had his own favorite treatments based on theoretical principles that bore no relationship to reality, and there was no mechanism for learning from failure or success. The modern pharmaceutical development process involves careful testing, systematic observation, and abandoning approaches that don't work, but Renaissance medicine just kept trying the same ineffective treatments repeatedly because they were theoretically supposed to work according to humoral theory. Henry's leg wounds were essentially a natural experiment in wound care and infection management that could have taught physicians valuable lessons. but the lack of scientific method meant all that potential knowledge was lost. Future patients would receive exactly the same useless treatments because nobody learned anything from Henry's case, except sometimes people died despite our best efforts, which was hardly a novel discovery. The psychological phenomenon of denial on a societal scale is evident in how Henry's court and government continue to function as if their king was healthy and competent, even when he clearly wasn't, creating a collective fiction that everyone participated in because acknowledging reality was too dangerous. Modern organizations show similar patterns when powerful leaders decline. Everyone pretends the emperor is wearing magnificent clothes while he's obviously naked and also possibly decomposing. The difference is that in modern democracies, there are theoretically mechanisms for removing leaders who become incapacitated, though these mechanisms often aren't used because acknowledging the leader's incapacity is politically difficult and potentially destabilizing. Henry's court had no removal mechanism at all, so the only options were denial or treason, and most people sensibly chose denial. This created an environment where increasingly bizarre and destructive decisions were implemented as if they were normal policy, where the king's obvious physical and mental decline was ignored in official communications, and where everyone just hoped Henry would die soon and end the uncertainty. It's a profoundly dysfunctional system, but it's also remarkably resilient. Henry's government continued to function throughout his decline, collecting taxes, enforcing laws, and conducting diplomacy, even though the person theoretically in charge was progressively less capable of actual leadership. The bureaucracy ran itself while pretending to follow royal direction, which is probably how a lot of monarchies actually function behind the ceremonial facade. The gender dynamics of Henry's situation are particularly interesting because his declining virility and impotence, results of his obesity, circulatory problems, and general poor health, occur at the same time. He was most desperate to prove his masculine power through multiple marriages and producing heirs. The younger wives he married in his later years faced the unpleasant reality of a husband who was physically incapable of performing sexually in any satisfying way, which contributed to the marital disasters of his final years. Catherine Howard's alleged infidelities, whether real or fabricated, make a certain tragic sense in this context. A teenage girl married to an obese, impotent old man whose legs smelled like death might reasonably look elsewhere for affection or sexual fulfillment. Henry's response to this threat to his masculine ego was characteristically violent. Execution for her and her alleged lovers. Because if he couldn't be a real man through sexual prowess, he could at least prove his power through the ability to order deaths. Catherine Parr, his final wife, was essentially hired as a nurse companion rather than a romantic partner, chosen for her ability to manage his medical care and soothe his moods rather than for her appearance or fertility. The evolution of Henry's marriages from the love match with Catherine of Aragon through the passionate disaster with Anne Boleyn to the transactional arrangement with Catherine Parr mirrors his physical decline from vigorous athlete to bedridden invalid. The military consequences of Henry's physical decline extended beyond his poor strategic decisions to affect England's actual military capability and reputation. A king who couldn't ride a horse or lead troops personally sent a message about English strength that affected how other European powers viewed England as a potential ally or enemy. France and Spain could field kings who personally led armies and demonstrated military prowess, while England had a king who needed to be carried around in a litter and commanded from behind the lines. This perception of weakness affected diplomatic negotiations, military alliances, and the likelihood of invasion or attack. Henry tried to compensate through aggressive posturing and expensive military displays, but everyone knew the reality. England's king was physically incapable of military leadership in any meaningful sense. The military campaigns of the 1540s were partly attempts to demonstrate that England was still a significant military power despite having an invalid king, but the enormous expense and limited success actually demonstrated the opposite. Henry's inability to effectively command armies personally meant that military leadership fell to subordinates who weren't always competent and whose authority was undermined by Henry's tendency to micromanage from a distance based on incomplete or inaccurate information. It's hard to run an effective military campaign when your commander-in-chief is several days' travel away from the front lines, in constant pain, frequently feverish, and making decisions based on reports filtered through multiple intermediaries. The religious confusion that Henry's physical and mental decline created reached absurd levels by the mid-1540s, when even educated clergy and theologians couldn't figure out what the official doctrine actually was because it seemed to change based on the king's mood swings and pain levels. One week, reformist preachers would be encouraged. The next week, they'd be investigated for heresy. Traditional Catholic practices would be defended, then condemned, then defended again. English Bibles would be mandated for churches, then restricted, then mandated again with different rules. The 6 Articles of 1539 established one set of doctrines, but their enforcement varied wildly depending on which faction had the king's ear at any given moment. This wasn't theological flexibility or nuanced policy development. This was chaos driven by a king whose decision-making process was impaired by chronic illness, creating an environment where nobody knew what was safe to believe or preach. Clergy who guessed wrong about the current theological position could find themselves facing charges of heresy or treason, creating a climate of fear that inhibited genuine religious discussion and debate. The irony is that Henry had broken from Rome partly to establish clear royal authority over the English Church, but his declining health created exactly the kind of confusion and instability he'd supposedly been trying to avoid. Religious policy became a weird mirror of Henry's physical condition, unstable, inconsistent, prone to sudden, painful shifts, and increasingly disconnected from any coherent underlying principle. The palliative care that Henry received in his final months was primitive by modern standards, but actually somewhat advanced for the 16th century, focusing on comfort and pain management when cure was clearly impossible. His physicians knew he was dying and shifted their approach from attempting to heal to simply making him more comfortable, which is basically the definition of palliative care. They increased his alcohol consumption for pain relief, adjusted his positioning to reduce pressure on the leg ulcers, tried to manage his diet to prevent digestive distress, and generally focused on quality of remaining life rather than quantity. This approach was actually more humane and patient-centered than a lot of medieval medicine, which tended to keep trying aggressive treatments right up until the moment of death regardless of patient suffering. The problem was that 16th century palliative care was still pretty terrible. The pain medications available were insufficient for the level of chronic pain Henry was experiencing. Comfort measures were limited by lack of understanding of pressure ulcers and infection control, and psychological support was basically non-existent. Henry died in significant pain and discomfort despite everyone's best efforts, which was unfortunately the normal outcome for chronic illness in pre-modern medicine. Modern palliative care could have made his final months much more tolerable with proper pain management, wound care, psychological support, and honest conversations about dying and legacy. But those tools and approaches were centuries in the future. The succession planning that Henry attempted in his final years was complicated by his awareness of his own mortality, combined with his inability to accurately assess his children's capabilities or the political situation they would face after his death. He knew Edward was sickly and young, but he couldn't really prepare adequate protections or establish a stable regency, because acknowledging how vulnerable Edward would be meant acknowledging how soon Henry himself would be dead. He included his daughters in the succession, but maintained that they were technically illegitimate, creating legal confusion that would cause problems later. He tried to balance competing factions in the Regency Council, but was probably too impaired in his final months to prevent manipulation of the arrangements. The result was a succession plan that looked reasonable on paper, but immediately fell apart in practice, because it was designed by a man whose judgment was impaired and who couldn't admit how little time he had left to prepare his son for kingship. If Henry had faced his mortality honestly and spent his final years systematically preparing Edward for rule, establishing stable governance structures, and creating real protections against faction fighting, English history might have been significantly different. Instead, he spent his final years in denial about his condition, making plans based on optimistic assumptions about his remaining time, and failing to adequately prepare for the chaos that his death would create. The financial audit of Henry's final years, if anyone had dared conduct one honestly, would have revealed spending patterns that range from questionable to completely insane, with massive resources devoted to maintaining royal comfort while the kingdom's infrastructure and economy deteriorated. The costs associated with Henry's medical care, dietary requirements, mobility accommodations, and general maintenance of his failing body consumed resources that could have funded schools, roads, hospitals, or literally anything more productive than gold tubes shoved into infected wounds. His daily food consumption alone cost more than what most families earned a year, and that doesn't include the medical expenses, the servant salaries, the architectural modifications, or the mechanical devices required to move him around. Meanwhile, the dissolution of monasteries had eliminated much of England's social safety net without creating adequate replacements, leaving the poor and sick with nowhere to turn, while massive resources flowed toward keeping one obese monarch comfortable in his decline. The economic irrationality of this resource allocation is staggering from modern perspective, but it was completely normal for pre-modern monarchies where the king's comfort and dignity took absolute priority over everything else, including the welfare of millions of subjects whose taxes funded royal excess. Henry's medical expenses alone could have funded construction of dozens of hospitals that would have actually helped people, but instead the money went toward trying to keep one man alive despite his body's very reasonable decision that it was time to shut down. The cultural production surrounding Henry's later years shifted from celebration to propaganda, with artists and writers increasingly tasked with creating images and texts that contradicted obvious reality. The portraits from this period are masterpieces of flattering deception, using pose, lighting, and strategic framing to make Henry look powerful and imposing rather than obese and decrepit. The Holbein portraits are so iconic that they've shaped our entire image of Henry VIII, but they're essentially Renaissance Photoshop, carefully constructed to hide reality. Writers praising the king had to find increasingly creative ways to describe his majesty and vigor without actually lying about specifics that everyone could see were false. Court poets wrote elaborate verses about Henry's greatness that carefully avoided mentioning anything physical except in the most abstract terms. This propaganda effort required substantial resources and talent deployed toward maintaining a fiction, resources that could have been used for creating actual art, literature, or music of lasting value. The tragedy is that some genuinely talented artists and writers spent their careers producing propaganda for a dying tyrant instead of creating work that might have had real cultural significance. The art that survives from Henry's later period is technically skilled but soulless, serving political necessity rather than aesthetic or intellectual exploration. The psychological profile of someone who would marry Henry in his later years is fascinating to contemplate, because it required either extraordinary ambition, complete lack of information about what the job actually entailed, or absolutely no other options. Catherine Howard was young enough to possibly not fully understand what she was getting into, and her family certainly pushed the match for their own advancement regardless of what it meant for her. Catherine Parr, by contrast, was a mature widow who apparently understood exactly what the position required. Not romance or passion, but skilled nursing care, diplomatic household management, and the ability to survive proximity to a paranoid tyrant. She approached the role like a very dangerous job that paid extremely well, but might result in sudden death, which was basically accurate. The bravery or possibly desperation required to voluntarily marry late-period Henry VIII cannot be overstated. You're agreeing to share a bed with a man whose body is literally rotting, manages rage episodes, navigate court politics, where one wrong move means execution, and do all of this with a smile, while maintaining the fiction that you're honored and delighted by the arrangement. Catherine Parr's survival and eventual inheritance of substantial wealth shows she understood the assignment and executed it flawlessly, but it must have been absolutely exhausting and frequently terrifying. The fact that she remarried quickly after Henry's death suggests her marriage to him was more professional obligation than personal choice, which makes sense given the circumstances. The servants' economy that existed around Henry's physical care represents an entire employment sector that we don't usually think about. People whose jobs existed solely because one man's body was failing and who would need to find new employment when he died. The grooms of the stool, the physicians, the carriers, the specialized craftsmen making mechanical hoists and oversized furniture, the people who procured exotic medical ingredients, the servants who dealt with laundry and waste from infected wounds. All of these people had jobs that depended on Henry's continued existence despite his medical disasters. Their employment was both secure. Henry wasn't getting better, so their services would be needed indefinitely, and precarious. If Henry died, their specialized skills would be largely useless. Some servants built entire careers around managing royal incontinence and wound care, developing expertise that had no application outside the very specific context of serving an invalid monarch. When Henry died, this entire employment sector had to find new roles or new employers, though presumably the basic skills of dealing with disgusting medical situations without flinching transferred to other contexts. The economic impact of one person's health crisis creating and then eliminating dozens of specialized jobs is yet another way that Henry's physical decline rippled through English society in ways we don't usually consider. The international diplomatic consequences of Henry's decline manifested in ways both obvious and subtle, as foreign ambassadors reported back about English stability and leadership capacity based partly on observations of the king's health. The French and Spanish courts received regular reports describing Henry's size, mobility problems, and general health status, which influenced their strategic calculations about England's military capacity and political reliability. A king who might die at any moment creates uncertainty for allies and opportunities for enemies, affecting treaty negotiations, military alliances, and trade relationships. Some of Henry's diplomatic correspondence from his final years was probably actually written by clerks or advisors while Henry was too ill to participate, but it had to be presented as if the king personally crafted every word because acknowledging his incapacity would undermine England's negotiating position. Foreign ambassadors became skilled at reading between the lines of official communications and observing court behavior to assess the king's actual condition, essentially conducting medical intelligence gathering to inform their government's policies. The fact that a monarch's health could be a matter of international strategic importance shows how personalized politics remained even in the increasingly bureaucratized governments of the 16th century. Henry wasn't just a figurehead. His personal capacity to make decisions and command respect directly affected England's international position and security. The theological implications of Henry's suffering created interesting questions that nobody could ask openly. If the king ruled by divine right and was God's chosen representative, what did his physical decay and suffering mean about divine favor? Catholic opponents of the English Reformation could point to Henry's afflictions as evidence of God's displeasure with his break from Rome, though doing so too openly was obviously dangerous. Protestant reformers had to explain why God would allow his chosen instrument for religious change to suffer so terribly, sometimes arguing that suffering purified the soul or tested faith. Henry himself seems to have avoided serious theological reflection on his condition, perhaps because the implications were too uncomfortable to contemplate. The medieval and Renaissance worldview included strong beliefs about divine punishment for sin manifest through physical affliction, which made chronic illness a potential sign of moral failure or divine disfavor. Henry's insistence on his righteous and his divine appointment sat uneasily with the reality of his rotting body, creating cognitive dissonance that could only be managed through denial and not asking uncomfortable questions. Modern secular perspectives separate moral worth from physical health, but in Henry's era, the connection was assumed, making his physical decay a potential theological crisis that everyone carefully avoided discussing. The comparison between Henry's final years and the decline of other absolute monarchs throughout history reveals common patterns: isolation, paranoia, poor decision-making, manipulation by courtiers, and deteriorating legacy as physical and mental capacity declines. Louis XIV of France, Frederick the Great of Prussia, and numerous other monarchs showed similar patterns of increasing irrationality, cruelty, and disconnection from reality as they aged and their health failed. The fundamental problem with absolute monarchy is that there's no good mechanism for managing the transition when the monarch becomes incapable of governing effectively. Democratic systems have impeachment, votes of no confidence, and regular elections that theoretically provide peaceful mechanisms for removing incapacitated leaders, though these don't always work well in practice. Monarchies just have to wait for the monarch to die, managing the chaos in the meantime and hoping the succession goes smoothly. Henry's case is particularly dramatic because his decline was so prolonged and so physically grotesque. But the underlying pattern of absolute power plus declining capacity equals disaster is depressingly common throughout history. The lesson, if anyone bothered to learn it, is that political systems should have mechanisms for managing leadership transitions that don't require waiting for someone to die while they make increasingly terrible decisions. The medical tourism that Henry's condition might have inspired if he'd been willing to seek help outside England never materialized, because traveling anywhere would have been extremely difficult given his size and mobility problems, and also because admitting he needed exotic treatments would acknowledge the severity of his condition. There were physicians in Italy, the Middle East, and even Asia who had different medical knowledge and approaches that might have offered new treatment options. Though realistically, they probably wouldn't have helped either, since nobody in the 16th century could actually treat bone infections effectively. The cultural assumption that English and French medicine were the pinnacle of medical knowledge, combined with Henry's inability to travel and unwillingness to seem weak, meant he only received treatments from physicians trained in traditional European humoral theory. It's interesting to speculate whether Islamic medical knowledge, which was in some ways more advanced than European medicine at the time, might have offered different approaches to wound care or pain management that could have helped, but we'll never know because Henry's pride, physical limitations, and cultural prejudices prevented any meaningful medical cross-pollination. His treatment was limited to what was available within his own medical tradition, which unfortunately meant treatments that ranged from ineffective to harmful with nothing actually curative available. The domestic policy chaos of Henry's final years reflected his declining ability to focus on governance, with increasing reliance on advisors and bureaucrats who might or might not be implementing policies that aligned with royal intentions. Major decisions about poor relief, economic regulation, local governance, and social policy were being made by committees and councils, while Henry focused on his immediate physical discomfort and personal grievances. This created opportunities for courtiers to advance their own agendas under the cover of royal authority, since verifying whether the king actually approved something required access to the king, which was carefully controlled. Some policies attributed to Henry in his final years were probably decisions made by others in his name, with his signature obtained during moments when he was barely conscious or too impaired to understand what he was signing. This isn't necessarily conspiracy or fraud. It's the practical reality of governing when your monarch is incapacitated, but the system requires his approval for legitimacy. The bureaucracy did its best to keep things running while maintaining the fiction of royal control, but the result was inconsistent policy implementation, factional fighting over who could claim royal authority, and general uncertainty about what the government was actually trying to achieve. Henry's physical decline created a governance crisis that England muddled through somehow, but it wasn't pretty, and it left problems that persisted into his children's reigns. The architectural and engineering innovations developed to accommodate Henry's immobility had some positive spillover effects, as the mechanical hoisting devices, ramps, and mobility aids designed for the king influenced later developments in accessibility accommodations. The craftsmen who built devices to move Henry's enormous body around the palaces developed expertise in mechanical engineering that could be applied to other contexts, like moving heavy cargo or construction materials. The architectural modifications for accessibility, while designed for one person, established principles that could benefit others with mobility limitations. It's a tiny silver lining to the massive cloud of Henry's decline. At least some useful engineering knowledge was gained from the process of accommodating his disability, even if that wasn't the primary intention. Of course, These innovations were only available to the wealthy and powerful. Ordinary disabled people continued to struggle without accommodation or assistance. But the precedent of modifying environments for accessibility rather than simply expecting disabled people to suffer or be confined existed, even if it took centuries for those principles to be applied more broadly. Henry's immobility created problems that required engineering solutions, and some of those solutions had applications beyond their original context. The final accounting of Henry VIII's reign must balance his genuine achievements in the first half against the disasters of his later years, when physical and mental decline affected his judgment and behavior. Young Henry strengthened the navy, patronized the arts, maintained England's position in European politics, and generally governed reasonably well. Old Henry executed thousands, bankrupted the kingdom, created religious chaos that caused decades of conflict, and made decisions that any objective observer could see were terrible, but that nobody could challenge. The question of how to evaluate his legacy requires weighing accomplishments against atrocities, successes against failures, and somehow accounting for the fact that a significant portion of his worst behavior occurred when he was probably not fully rational due to chronic pain, infection, and possible brain damage. This doesn't excuse his actions. He still chose to execute people, launch wasteful wars, and create chaos rather than acknowledging his limitations and delegating more effectively. But it does complicate the simple narrative of tyrant or hero, suggesting instead a more tragic story of capability destroyed by physical decay, creating suffering that spread far beyond one man's personal experience of pain and disability. The environmental health hazards that Henry's condition created within the palaces are something that nobody discusses, but must have been significant, because infected wounds produce biohazardous waste that requires proper disposal, and 16th century sanitation wasn't exactly up to modern hospital standards. The bandages removed from Henry's legs multiple times daily were soaked with pus, blood, and infected tissue, basically bags of bacteria that had to go somewhere. In an era before proper waste disposal or understanding of disease transmission, these contaminated materials were probably just burned or thrown into waste heaps, potentially spreading infection to servants handling them or creating breeding ground for disease vectors. The rooms where Henry's wounds were dressed would have been contaminated with infectious material, and without proper disinfection protocols, subsequent occupants or visitors could have been exposed to pathogens. The servants who handled his infected bandages, cleaned his wounds, and dealt with his bodily waste were essentially working in biohazard conditions without any protective equipment or understanding of infection control. It's actually remarkable that we don't have records of servants developing similar infections from handling Henry's contaminated materials, though perhaps they did and nobody bothered recording the illnesses of lowly servants. The palace environment around Henry in his final years was probably significantly less sanitary and more disease-prone than other parts of the royal residences, creating a localized health hazard that moved with him from room to room. The written records that survive from Henry's physicians are frustratingly vague about specifics, probably because documenting the king's medical conditions in detail was politically sensitive and potentially dangerous. Physicians' notes that described exactly how bad the leg ulcers were, how much the king's cognitive function had declined, or how terrible his prognosis actually was could be used against them later if things went wrong. So instead we get euphemistic descriptions that hint at problems without stating them clearly, making it difficult for modern historians and medical professionals to reconstruct exactly what was happening. This pattern of medical documentation that obscures rather than clarifies continues today when treating powerful people, where medical records might downplay severity or use vague language to protect both patient and physician. The result is that we know Henry had leg ulcers and died, but the exact progression of his condition, the specific infections involved, and the precise cause of death remains somewhat mysterious despite relatively extensive documentation. The physicians who could have provided the most detailed accounts were probably too scared to write everything down honestly, knowing that future political shifts could make their candid medical observations look like treason or incompetence. Medical transparency conflicts with political necessity when your patient is an absolute monarch, and political necessity usually wins. The succession politics that exploded immediately after Henry's death show how much energy had been spent on maintaining the fiction of royal health rather than actually preparing for the transition. Within hours of Henry's death being announced, Edward Seymour had seized control of the young Edward VI, arrested potential rivals, and essentially staged a coup that overturned Henry's supposedly balanced regency arrangements. This couldn't have been organized in a few hours. It required weeks or months of planning while Henry was still alive, meaning that courtiers were actively preparing for his death while outwardly maintaining that he would recover and reign for years. The speed and efficiency of Seymour's power grab suggests extensive preparation that must have involved secret meetings, alliance building, and contingency planning that would have been treasonous if discovered. Everyone had been planning for Henry's death while pretending he was immortal, creating a weird double reality where official discourse maintained one thing while actual behavior prepared for another. The moment Henry died, the mask came off and everyone revealed they'd been preparing for this all along, which must have been psychologically jarring for people who'd spent months or years maintaining the fiction. The succession arrangements Henry thought he'd made were immediately ignored because everyone knew they were created by a man whose judgment was impaired and whose death was imminent and inevitable. The psychological concept of anticipatory grief that Henry's courtiers must have experienced, mourning the loss of someone who's still alive but clearly dying, wasn't understood in the 16th century but must have affected how people related to him in his final years. Servants and advisors who had known healthy Henry and watched his decline were essentially mourning the person he'd been, while still having to serve the person he'd become. This creates a strange emotional dynamic where you're grieving someone who's standing right in front of you, except they're not really the same person anymore. The young, athletic, charming king had effectively died years before his body finally gave out, replaced by someone who looked similar but behaved completely differently. Courtiers had to manage their grief for the Henry they remembered while dealing with the practical reality of serving the Henry who existed, all while pretending nothing had changed and the king was still the magnificent figure of legend. This emotional labor of maintaining public performance while experiencing private grief must have been exhausting, especially over the extended period of Henry's decline. Modern hospice workers and caregivers for people with degenerative conditions understand this dynamic. But in Henry's court, there was no vocabulary for it and no support for people experiencing it. The religious artifacts and relics that Henry collected and kept near him during his illness reveal an interesting contradiction between his official break with Rome and Catholic practices and his personal need for spiritual comfort when facing mortality. Despite having dissolved monasteries and rejected papal authority, Henry maintained possession of numerous Catholic relics and sacred objects that he apparently believed had healing or protective powers. This wasn't unusual for the time. Lots of people maintained contradictory religious beliefs and practices, but it's revealing about Henry's personal theology and his fear of death. When you're dying and in pain, theological consistency matters less than finding comfort wherever you can. Henry's official religious position was carefully calculated political theology, but his personal spiritual practices were probably more traditionally Catholic than his public reformation suggested. The gap between public religious policy and private religious practice created yet another layer of unreality around late-period Henry, where what he said and what he did religiously didn't always align. This contradiction made it even harder for courtiers and clergy to figure out what the king actually wanted religiously, since his policies said one thing, but his personal behavior sometimes suggested another. The result was that nobody really knew what Henry believed except possibly Henry himself, and given his declining mental state, he might not have been entirely clear on it either. The animals that were part of court life during Henry's decline, the hunting dogs, horses, and various other creatures that populated royal palaces, experienced the changes in his lifestyle along with everyone else. Henry's beloved hunting dogs, which had once accompanied him on frequent hunts, now rarely saw their master and must have wondered why the vigorous man who used to exercise them constantly had been replaced by an immobile figure who could barely acknowledge their presence. The horses in the royal stables, some of them specifically trained for Henry's use, stood essentially unemployed as their owner became unable to ride. There's something poignant about these animals that had been part of Henry's active lifestyle becoming obsolete as his body failed, living out their lives in royal comfort, but never really understanding why everything had changed. The servants who cared for these animals must have felt the contrast keenly, remembering when the king would burst into the stables demanding his horse for an impromptu hunt, versus the later reality where the stables were quiet and the king was carried everywhere by humans. Even the animals were affected by Henry's decline, their routines and purposes disrupted by one man's failing health, though at least they weren't at risk of execution for noticing the changes. The economic ripple effects of Henry's medical expenses extended throughout the English economy in ways that are difficult to quantify, but definitely significant. The exotic ingredients required for his treatments had to be imported, creating demand that affected international trade networks. The gold for his drainage tubes had to be sourced, refined, and crafted by specialists. The servants employed in his care spent their salaries in local economies, creating secondary economic effects. The resources devoted to royal medical care were resources not available for other purposes, creating opportunity costs throughout the economic system. Some merchants and craftsmen became wealthy, supplying the royal household with medical necessities, while others lost business because resources were diverted toward royal health rather than other consumption. The economic distortion created by one individual consuming resources at such an extraordinary rate, especially for medically useless purposes, represents a massive misallocation of societal resources that affected economic development and welfare distribution. In a healthier economic system, those resources would have been distributed more efficiently based on actual productivity and need, but monarchical systems concentrated resources toward royal consumption regardless of utility or fairness. Henry's medical expenses were just one extreme example of the broader economic dysfunction of absolute monarchy, where royal whim determined resource allocation rather than any rational economic principle. The modern medical management of someone like Henry VIII would involve a multidisciplinary team, including infectious disease specialists, wound care nurses, pain management experts, physical therapists, nutritionists, psychiatrists, and probably several other specialties working together to address his multiple interconnected health problems. The infected leg would be treated with appropriate antibiotics after bacterial culture to identify the specific pathogen. The wound would receive modern wound care, including debridement of dead tissue, proper dressings, and possibly negative pressure wound therapy to promote healing. His obesity would be addressed through dietary counseling and supervised weight loss to reduce stress on the wound and improve overall health. Pain management would involve appropriate medications that actually work rather than just alcohol. Physical therapy would maintain as much mobility as possible and prevent secondary complications from immobility. Psychiatric care would address the depression, anxiety, and other mental health impacts of chronic pain and disability. The contrast between what modern medicine could offer and what Henry actually received highlights how far medical science has advanced, but also raises questions about whether modern politicians and powerful people actually receive optimal care, or whether proximity to power still distorts medical decision-making. Do modern leaders get good medical care? Or do they get care that prioritizes maintaining function and image over honesty about limitations, similar to how Henry's physicians had to prioritize maintaining royal dignity over optimal medical outcomes? The cultural memory of Henry VIII in popular media tends to focus on his 6 wives and religious break with Rome, while downplaying or romanticizing his physical decline, creating a distorted image that misses how much his medical condition shaped his later reign. Movies and TV shows usually show Henry as either young and vigorous or old and fat, without really grappling with the transition between those states or how that transition affected his behavior and decisions. The rotting leg, the chronic pain, the mobility problems, and the psychological effects of physical decay rarely feature prominently in popular depictions, partly because they're unpleasant and partly because they complicate simple narratives of Henry as either romantic hero or villainous tyrant. A more accurate portrayal would show the tragedy of physical decline destroying a person's capabilities and judgment, creating suffering that spread far beyond the individual to affect millions. But that's a more complex and less dramatic narrative than King has 6 wives, so popular culture tends to simplify. The result is that most people know Henry had 6 wives, but don't know that an infected leg ulcer probably influenced his decision to execute 2 of them, which is a significant gap in historical understanding. His medical condition isn't just a footnote. It's central to understanding his later reign and its consequences, but gets relegated to background information while more dramatic but less consequential details receive emphasis. The final irony of writing a detailed narrative about Henry VIII's physical decline is that we've now spent considerably more time thinking about his rotting leg than most of his contemporaries would have wanted to, given that they worked very hard to avoid acknowledging it. The elaborate social machinery designed to pretend the king was fine has been completely dismantled by historical analysis that examines exactly what was wrong and how it affected everything. Henry would probably be mortified to know that 500 years later, people are still discussing his infected wounds, mobility problems, and personal degradation in excruciating detail. He spent enormous resources and effort trying to maintain the image of royal power and dignity. And here we are cataloging every embarrassing detail of his physical decay. But that's what happens when you're a historical figure. Your carefully constructed image eventually crumbles, and researchers pick through the debris looking for truth. The gap between how Henry wanted to be remembered as a great king, mighty warrior, and powerful ruler, and how we actually remember him as the guy with 6 wives who got really fat and whose leg was rotting, would probably enrage him, but it's a more honest assessment of who he actually was and what his reign actually accomplished. The legend has been thoroughly deflated, replaced by a more human and ultimately more interesting story of physical decline, psychological deterioration, and the catastrophic consequences when absolute power meets bodily failure. Now, let's bring this whole grotesque historical carnival into the present day and ask ourselves some deeply uncomfortable questions. Imagine if Henry VIII were alive right now. Same personality, same medical disaster, but with modern medicine and technology. The infected leg gets antibiotics and proper wound care. So instead of dying at 55, he lives to 85, running England, or let's be honest, probably posting on Twitter, for another 30 years of increasingly deranged decision-making. Modern pain management means he's functional enough to keep making terrible choices, but medicated enough to develop dependency issues. Physical therapy and bariatric surgery let him maintain mobility, so there's no natural limit to his reign of terror. Democracy? Please. We've watched modern leaders cling to power despite obvious physical and mental decline, watched enablers and yes-men maintain fictions about their capability, watched political systems fail to remove people who clearly shouldn't be making decisions. Henry, with modern medicine and modern media, would be an absolute nightmare. Imagine the tweet storms, the Fox News appearances, the podcast where he explains why his latest wife totally deserved what she got. The horrifying truth is that we haven't really solved the fundamental problem Henry illustrated. What happens when powerful people experience physical and mental decline, but the system has no good mechanism for managing that transition? We've just gotten better at prolonging the decline and worse at acknowledging when someone needs to step down. Henry VIII died because his body finally gave out despite everyone's best efforts to keep him alive. Today, we could keep Henry alive indefinitely, which raises the question, would that actually be better, or would we just be extending the suffering and chaos while pretending everything was fine?